You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last edition this week of the most disruptive show covering news and events, not only in our divided states, but across the surface of our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Getting directly into the headlines this morning. First up in COVID news, at least 3,293 new coronavirus deaths and 238,189 new cases were reported in the United States on December 17th. That's yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 213,165 cases per day, an increase of 18% from the average 2 weeks earlier. A panel of outside advisors to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration on Thursday endorsed emergency use of Moderna Inc.'s coronavirus vaccine. This comes 1 week after the same panel backed a similar vaccine from Pfizer and BioNTech, leading to an FDA emergency use authorization a day later. The FDA is expected to grant Moderna an emergency use authorization as early as late Thursday or Friday. Brazil's Supreme Court has ruled that Brazilians are required to be vaccinated against COVID-19 under the penalty of being banned from certain public activities and spaces. 10 justices of the 11-member court backed the mandatory inoculation with only one vote against in a virtual session held Thursday. The ruling is a blow to President Jair Bolsonaro, who has said he won't get a vaccine and that nobody should be forced to. The Energy Department and National Nuclear Security Administration, which maintains the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile, report that they have evidence that hackers accessed their networks as part of an extensive espionage operation that has affected at least half a dozen federal agencies. Officials directly familiar with the matter said. On Thursday, the Department of Energy and NNSA officials began coordinating notifications about the breach to their congressional oversight bodies after being briefed by Rocky Campion, the chief information officer at the Department of Energy. This is part of the wider sort of hacking wave in this past week, at least allegedly. I just want to briefly point out, as far as I know, I'm not denying that it happened, but I also haven't seen proof that it happened. First of all, and then various politicians and news outlets have immediately, specifically, I'm looking at you, the Washington Post, have immediately attributed these hacks to Russia. Thankfully, not everybody has, but even with that, of course, as far as I know, there's no proof. I saw Glenn Greenwald, prominent journalist, saying, as far as he's seen, there's no group. Don't jump to assumptions here. He's right about that. I also saw Senator Dick Durbin saying that this was an act tantamount to war. That's effectively what he said. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but that's basically what he said. That this was almost a virtual declaration of war, I believe was the phrase, by Russia. Again, that is a massive leap, and of course, hugely bellicose itself to say that. Anyway, Jamarl, what's your take?
One of the weirder aspects of this, as you're reading through some of the paperwork or the documentation, their password was known. SolarWinds 123. If we're talking about the same thing, right? I mean, they're saying that the Russians did it. They haven't exposed any proof of that. I mean, that basically, again, they're asserting, and take our word for it. It seems that they're also making this assertion that this type of activity is denoted by the Russians. You know what I mean? It's like the signature denotes X, but they don't know that. Like those things, it's so much. There's all of this assumption, and it's like Cold War hysteria baked on assumption, and the American public goes with it, right? Because It's the hacking, just like Navalny. They supposedly poisoned the guy like multiple times. I mean, it's just, it gets to be so thick at one point. Right here, a security researcher said he warned SolarWinds in 2019 that the IT company update server could be accessed using the password SolarWinds123, according to Tuesday's Reuters report. So yeah, the Russians.
Exactly. Absolutely hilarious. Getting back into headlines here for a second. President-elect Joe Biden chose Representative Deb Haaland of New Mexico's 1st Congressional District on Thursday to serve as the first Native American cabinet secretary and to head the Interior Department. That's a pick that marks a turning point for the United States relationship with the nation's indigenous peoples. Haaland is currently the chair of the subcommittee on national parks, forests, and public land. So unlike Pete Buttigieg, that actually makes a little bit more sense. Rep. Justin Amash yesterday announced a bill to end civil asset forfeiture, which allows the government to take property from someone without ever charging them with a crime, known as the Civil Asset Forfeiture Elimination Act. Amash states that it would, quote, repeal civil asset forfeiture nationwide, end quote, sharing the text of the bill in a series of tweets sent Thursday afternoon. International headlines. More than 300 schoolboys kidnapped in northern Nigeria were handed over to government security, the Katsina state governor said in a televised interview. The boys, whose abduction was claimed by Islamist militant group Boko Haram in an unverified audio recording, have now arrived back in Katsina State. It is, by the way, still unclear exactly the details of their release, exactly how this came about. You know, if there were concessions, if there was money paid, or if this was how this happened. It's all still murky as far as I can tell.
If money was paid,
what's that, Jamarl?
If money was paid for it, would that be a good thing or bad thing?
Be a good thing for those kids and a bad thing for the sort of game theoretic continuation of that terrorist group, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, then they're incentivized to abduct more.
Exactly. Like that, it's such a weird position
but it's pretty grisly.
Yeah. So what the government may do is they might have put some money behind the scenes. They might have gave something in some other compensation, but they don't necessarily want to let that be known. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like you said, it's a very weird scenario that all of a sudden they take kids and then all of a sudden they bring them back. And here they are. They just appear. It's like, what? What do you mean? It's just strange. The details of it are a little mysterious to me.
It's hard. Yeah, and if they just sent them back, it's hard to be magnanimous. Then the act that started the whole thing was your abduction. You know, you abduct them and then, okay, you can have them back. That doesn't exactly paint you as a hero. But I'm filling in a bunch of blanks there. I don't know what the hell happened. And it does, again, as I was listening to various news outlets describe this just a couple of minutes ago, they don't seem to either. It's still very murky exactly like what happened to cause this release, to cause the return of these kids. Anywho, the number of civilians forced from their homes by conflict in northern Mozambique has quadrupled this year to 420,000 people, according to the United Nations, which links the crisis in Cabo Delgado province not just to attacks by Islamist militants, which are ongoing, but to a perceived failure to distribute vast mineral and offshore gas revenues to the local population. So you got corruption on the one hand and jihadis on the other. France will return 27 colonial-era artifacts held in museums to Benin and Senegal within 1 year. This follows a unanimous vote by the National Assembly yesterday. Overriding late opposition from the Senate, the National Assembly gave its final approval to a restitution bill transferring ownership of 26 plundered royal artifacts from the Musée du Quai Branly-Jacques Chirac to the Republic of Benin and a sword from the Army Museum to Senegal. Pierre Buyoya, the former president of Burundi who twice seized power in military coups and oversaw a prolonged ethnic civil war that killed 300,000 of his countrymen, has died at 71, the government announced on Friday. He died of coronavirus, reportedly. And there are reportedly just a few hours left, quote unquote, for the UK and EU to agree to a post-Brexit trade deal. That's according to Michel Barnier, the French politician serving as the European Commission's head of task force for relations with the United Kingdom. Speaking in the European Parliament on Friday, the EU's chief negotiator said there was, quote, said it was, quote, the moment of truth, end quote, for the two sides to come to an agreement. He said there was still a, quote, chance of a deal, end quote, but the path is very narrow, Comments follow a warning from Boris Johnson that a no-deal scenario was very likely unless the EU position changed substantially. And moving into tech news, got a couple of headlines here. Colorado's Attorney General filed a lawsuit yesterday against Google, along with the Attorneys General of 37 other states, alleging that the tech giant is engaged in anti-competitive conduct in violation of Section 2 of the Sherman Act. In a press release, the Attorney General, Phil Weiser, said, quote, the states allege that Google illegally maintains its monopoly power over general search engines and related general search advertising markets through a series of anti-competitive contracts and conduct, end quote. This comes literally one day after Texas's Attorney General led the Attorneys General of 9 other states to file a similar lawsuit against Google. And by the way, there is some overlap between the Attorneys General who signed on to each of these independent lawsuits. South Dakota in particular, the state I'm currently residing in, or the state where I'm currently living, not even based out here. Anyway, so that's happening. And of course, this comes after the Department of Justice also sued Google back in October, similarly alleging uncompetitive and unfair practices. So a string of antitrust laws. Of course, I'm leaving out the antitrust lawsuit against Facebook. It seems like Google is really the giant that everybody's trying to take down at this point, though. Just interesting to know. And interesting to know, I mean, I'm curious. I kind of want to, it's a little bit hard to access the back end politics of why all this stuff is happening at the same time. You note that it happens on the other side of an election and also the other side of the confirmation of Biden. And so attorneys general might think that they have slightly more room to maneuver, in this period. It's also sort of the interregnum period where, Biden's not into, I'm filling again more blanks here. Biden's not in to fully oppose some policies that they're trying to push there, some aspects of these lawsuits that he might want to oppose or that, and neither is Trump in some sense because he's heading out. I don't know, man. I'm very curious that this is all happening at once, though, and it is happening. There's a lot of stuff going on, clearly. Anyway, next headline here. China's Chang'e 5 moon probe has landed in Inner Mongolia. China's Xinhua news agency has reported completing its return and bringing back the first lunar samples to the Earth since the 1970s. The return capsule touched down at about 2 a.m. local time and makes China the third country to have retrieved lunar samples after the United States and the Soviet Union, who 44 years ago launched the last successful mission to retrieve samples. Yesterday, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged the stock trading app Robinhood with, quote, misleading customers about revenue sources and failing to satisfy duty of best execution, end quote, tacking on a $65 million fine with that charge. And last headline here, a joint team of scientists have transmitted qubits of photons, single units of light, basically, across over 40 kilometers of fiber optic cable, using, quote, state-of-the-art low-noise superconducting nanowire single photon detectors and off-the-shelf optics, end quote. Scientists at Fermilab, AT&T, Caltech, Harvard University, the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, used to live right by there, and University of Calgary, say the process they've experimentally verified here could, quote, provide a realistic foundation for a high-fidelity quantum internet with practical devices, end quote. The Caltech and Fermilab teams plan to build a city-scale network called the Illinois Express Quantum Network in Chicago next, although this will still be experimental, a far cry from the gigabit internet that some folks are lucky enough to be able to use. In any event, those are our headlines. We are going into a break here in a second. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're actually going out on time early. This is slightly rare. Not a slow news day, but I think we're trying to do, at least what I'm trying to do, is to condense the headlines down slightly. So still pack a lot of information in there on a wide variety of news sources, but spend slightly less time on each one. And then if you have to, you go into more depth, but just rejiggering our format. Anyway, it's a little bit awkward to talk about this stuff in public, but I try to be awkward sometimes. Anyway, we're going into a break. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back with Jamarl Thomas's monologue on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
We actually let them expand on their views.
what's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and definitely share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. There has been a lot of talk in right-wing circles about a great reset. Now, I got to be honest. I often don't buy stuff like this. I mean, everything from, 2012 or the year 2000 and how each of those scenarios, something monstrous was going to take place. I'm pretty sure we'll have another one up at some kind of calendar or something like that that dooms or spells doom or foretells a horrible outcome. But I don't necessarily think that just because the way it's being talked about might be a little out there, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a dystopian version of our future that will get to something very, very similar. And I do think people should be aware of it, and I do think people should be concerned about where our country is going. We have two problematic streams. One is political, one is economic, and I'm pretty sure there are more than that, and you can even say conceptual, but I'm adding conceptual into the political. In one sense, you have a huge amount of cash going basically distributed to the top. On the other sense, you have a political system that enshrines that into law, meaning your political system basically allows that process to take place, and it creates enough intransigence, enough ossification, that it prevents anything real from taking place that will change the economic situation for the better. As long as the economic situation can't be changed, your country will have chaos. Understand for the moment, in order to have a decent human being, human beings aren't things to themselves. It's not like a baby comes out the womb and then clothes itself and go gets a job. It doesn't work that way. We require a base of operations to get started, pretty much like anything else. We need good food. We need clean air. We need clean water. We need the ability to interact with people within the context of a group and not necessarily be alienated from the larger group, meaning a sense of self. There are things that are necessary for a person to be a person. And when those things are not there, that individual suffers. And insofar as go as an individual, especially when you have a lot of them, your society will suffer also. It is no different than getting cancer or no different than getting some kind of illness because you ate hamburgers for 20 years. Changing one or two aspects wouldn't necessarily change the overarching aspect of things. There needs to be somewhat of a deeper look in trying to figure out why and trying to figure out how to change it. But more importantly than trying to figure out why and how to change it is at the very least acknowledge that this is going poorly. Conceptually, we have an odd point of view. We believe that work is the point. Work is not the point. People work in order to get things that they need. Meaning you work in order to get food. You work in order to get shelter. You work in order to get X. But in our case, that has been basically sublimated from the standpoint of cash. And then cash can be used for all of these things. But what happens when the work that you do doesn't necessarily supply the cash that you need to live? And it's not for lack of work. You might have 2 jobs. You might be working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. What happens? And then on top of that, you get a financial shock, just like you did in 2008. And then you get another financial shock, 2020. I'm making the point that in a very short period of time, your population that was already at the worst aspect of things got hit and then got hit again. And the president that was supposed to represent hope and change, that was supposed to be this flaming lefty that was going to bring communism to America, gave 95% of the income to the top 1% and let homeowners go bust. Yes, Obama could have taken that money that he was going to give to the banks, and he could have given it to the homeowners so those homeowners could pay the banks. That way, the homeowner wouldn't go bust and you would still pay off the banks. But for human beings, they have this tendency to say moral hazard. It is a moral hazard for me to do this. But it's not a moral hazard to do that for the banks. Very, very bizarre and not necessarily in the best interest. But our society looks at that stuff and thinks, well, people have to work. People have to toil away at this or toil away at that. And I'm making the point that that is not entirely true. And not just not entirely true, because society has that in their heads. As we get to a point where what is work changes. My problem is that what is work may not change fast enough in the context of human beings' consciousness. Meaning, right now, our economic system basically have all of these people working all of these jobs. Great. What happens when that gets constricted? We're okay with the 1% owning massive swaths of influence over technology, over electronics, over infrastructure. Well, what happens when workers no longer have the capacity to strike in those industries because those industries have been automated and the money gets ferreted to the top? Meaning, in a situation where you typically could strike, where you typically had these mechanisms and measures where you could bring the society to a halt. If the TSA wanted to, when Donald Trump basically turned around and furloughed all of those workers, meaning shut the government down, and they weren't getting paid, what happens if they stop doing their jobs? Does the airline industry come to a halt? Yes. But what happens if the airline industry is automated? Well, the complaints, you've just lost the mechanism of control from the standpoint of workers to put influence. What happens for the same thing for cars, meaning for taxi services? What happens for the standpoint of stores, meaning retail? I am making the point to you that in one service sector after the next, those jobs are going to be eliminated. You walk into a store, it reads your card as you walk in, you pick up whatever you pick up, you walk out, hit your card. Person doesn't need to be there. Might have a security guard, don't need to check out people. Same thing with delivery. The Uber driver comes to your house. Well, that may be automated. You may have to come out to the house. They may even have a robot that just walk up to the thing and drop it off at your door. I am making the point that they're going to find one way after the next to automate one issue of society after the next. And from the standpoint of us, workers, it undermines our ability to influence society, but also to make a living. If you get a society where the mechanisms of control are managed and held to the tune of the 1%, where you have the system where, let's say, a solar-powered car, where you hit your app, it comes to your house, drives you point A to point B, and then it goes off to the next person. Worker need not apply. You don't even need to add gas to that. That thing just goes on and on and on. I'm making the point that as our society changes and becomes more automated, there will be jobs that human beings could do. There will be things, of course, that human beings could do. Upkeep, labor, soft skill jobs like dealing with human beings. But many of the other jobs will go away. And fact of the matter is, we should applaud those jobs going away. I don't want a human being dropping french fries. With all the potential, all the capability that a person has at their disposal, the last thing I want them to do is sitting there dropping french fries. I don't want a person driving a car for 15 hours if a machine can do it better. By the same token, we also don't have a society that will look at those people and say, yeah, you're right. We don't need that guy doing that job. And so we're going to help that guy transition into another job. We leave that guy to his own devices. In West Virginia, where all of those coal miners, and you had the Democratic Party saying we're going to get rid of their jobs. What did they do? They jumped to the Republican Party. You're going to take my job. You're going to take my living away. But I'm making the point that the natural flow and momentum in and of itself of technology will do that. And as technology gets cheaper, whereas you're paying that guy $15 an hour and the robot is $14.90, the incentive itself creates itself every bit as much as shipping jobs overseas, importing the products back, firing the American worker, and exporting the profits to the top. The same thing is going to happen internally to the country. Mark my words. There is no reason for it not to. And the concern, the thing that I'm pointing out, is that the consciousness of the nation hasn't dealt with that, at least not in any real cognitive terms of what is this going to mean for work, what is this going to mean for people in that transition as work becomes something else, and how are people in our society going to regard that? It doesn't seem we're going to do that gingerly. The other part to this I want to add, going with the political thing one more time, has to do with Flynn. Trump's guy, Flynn, has called on Trump to basically declare martial law. And in declaring martial law, to then run the election again, quote, quote. What happens when you get into this future where many of these jobs bleed off, where the 1% is controlling all of these industries with mainly robots and computers, where shutting off your service when you aren't necessarily acting right? Maybe you are on a UBI because the jobs aren't necessarily there. And yeah, that does add a certain impetus, especially if you don't necessarily have the ability to have labor in and of yourself or the ability to make ends for yourself. What happens when the Congress or the people, the public, gets really angry because they don't like the conditions, but they don't have the capacity to strike, at least not in mass? And some right-winger somewhere working with companies in business declares martial law. Politically, I think this is where we're going. I think this is wrong-headed, but I think this is where we're going. And I think the Republican Party, a faction of that, this is what's coming. This is what they're going to look like. You can look at what the Democratic Party and what they were trending into. Look back at what a Democrat was, 20, 30 years ago, and look at what they are now. They moved to the right. Look at the way that Ronald Reagan would get called to account for the Iran deal. Yeah, the Iran deal, basically taking money and selling those weapons. He got in trouble for that. Obama didn't, even though it was known. I guess I'm making the point that your country moves further to the right, and you can see the stuff gets telegraphed. If he's talking about that, at some point, some other person will do that, especially when the ability of workers lose that much more influence in our society. This is the end run, meaning that is the end point where workers get angry with a society, get angry, and your government or whatever else puts the hammer down. Shane, what do you think? I think that is dystopian. And I do think, from some standpoint of a great reset, that we can trend into that, not in this kind of just fell swoop, but more so as it goes in a particular direction until one day you realize, oh, wait a minute, we've lost control of these vital services and we lost the ability to strike.
I think we're already there. I think we already have lost control of the vital services. And for the most part, look at the fact that nobody, as far as I can tell, there haven't been any major successful strikes in the U.S. in years, decades at this point. So we're already past that point. Organizational capacity has already been dissolved. It could be a good, in the window of opportunity that may still exist to try to pick that ability back up. But, the decline of the unions is, as far as I know, a fait accompli at this point. On the last point about martial law, I don't see that happening right now simply because most of the higher ups, from what Danny Scherzen has said, in the military lean Democrat. So while the rank and file might be red and bleed red, the generals, the officers aren't, and therefore what you'd get effectively is mutiny under Trump. So I don't see that happening in the next couple of weeks. Definitely down the line, that's totally a possibility, as it is, frankly, in every country. On the first larger point that you were making, where people will often go with this is trying to institute a basic income, a universal basic income or unconditional basic income. I'm going to come back. We only have a little bit of time here. I'm going to come back to my own idea in just a second. I don't think that would work because you always have purse strings being controlled by higher ups, potentially commanding political allegiance from the people who are receiving the basic income. But regardless, you're living in a sort of closed economy almost invariably where, if that economy goes through hyperinflation, you can sort of manually control the level of dissent in the population. It gets a little bit murky. But anyway, my replacement for it, instead of a universal basic income, what if people had like a universal basic means of production where various people across the country had access to resources that they could use to create what they needed to live, so that instead of, being dependent on a larger system to provide them money that they would then almost invariably spend on products produced by external corporations, they could just produce most things for themselves. And what you'd get is a sort of widely distributed state of self-sufficiency in the population. And ideally, some really interesting things on the other side of this. Anyway, we should come back and talk about this at some other point. We don't have enough time right now. We're going into a break. We'll be back in just a couple of seconds with Alexander Mercouris. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Mercouris. We are joined by Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You can follow Alexander's work with The Duran on Twitter at theduran_com. Also check out The Duran on YouTube and on their website, theduran.com again. Alexander, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Well, and it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Always a pleasure to have you as well. All right, let's get into Brexit here. We are really, truly pushing up against the deadline. Just briefly, just to lay things out, where do you think Brexit, the issue of Brexit, is going to stand in 2 weeks on the other side of the new year after this cliff has been reached?
I think the most likely outcome is that some kind of a deal is going to come. The reason I say that is because Boris Johnson has at various times given the impression that negotiations had to be determined by a particular date in order to allow for time for Parliament to pass whatever agreement was reached before the end of the year, when by law, by British law, there has to be a final agreement, because otherwise there would be a no-deal Brexit. But what has happened is that he has repeatedly extended the deadline. He has also, of course, gone to Brussels, negotiated directly with Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president. He's tried to hold direct negotiations with Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel, without success, by the way. But it seems to me that this gives every impression of a prime minister who does very much want to have a deal. I think if he wasn't interested in a deal, then he would have stayed in London. He would have stuck by his deadlines. He'd have stuck by his red lines about what to discuss, and we would not be looking at cliffhangers. So I suspect this cliffhanger that we're talking about at the moment is another artificial one. And I think that at some point over the next 2 weeks, we will see a deal done. And that deal will have to be rushed through the British Parliament at warp speed. And presumably the European Parliament and various European governments will have to go through their own ratification processes, but that may take a little long. But I think we will see a deal done before the end of the year. That's my guess. I mean, it's still possible that things could fall apart just before, but I think there is now political will to do a deal.
Alexander, what is the latest blip that has taken place? I mean, apparently there are, like you said, rushed negotiations that are taking place. And like you said, Boris Johnson has always shown a certain degree of brinksmanship, whether it was in the election fight where, you know, it was like where they kept saying, okay, we're going to end it on this date, or after the election, like you said, during the other Brexit negotiations. But what is the hiccup this time around? What's the issue that is causing the consternation between the UK and Brussels?
Well, there are two basic issues. One is fisheries, which is a very emotive issue in Britain. I mean, you must remember that Britain is an island. Fish has been historically a very important part of the British diet. The dish, the favoured food of the British working class is fish and chips, which is a dish which foreigners find indigestible, but there it is. So fish is a very emotive issue. And what happened was that when Britain joined the European Union, or the European Economic Community as it was, fish was shared across the entire European zones, and the British seas, basically they could be fished in or trawled by all European fishing people, because they became not British seas but European seas. But what has now happened is that Britain is leaving, and it says it wants its own waters back, and it wants to be able to fish in them, to establish its own fishing zone, basically not having French trawlers, and French fishermen and Danish fishermen and other fishermen coming into them. This is a very emotive issue because, of course, especially France, they've got into the habit of fishing in these waters. And, of course, the British, the seaside ports where the big fishing industries used to be located in Britain, they voted very hard for leave. They wanted to leave the European Union because they were angry about the fact that they had to share the fish there with other countries. And of course, they voted Conservative very solidly in the election last year. And then the other big sticking issue is regulation of British industries, and specifically, British manufacturing, where the Europeans insist on what they call a level playing field in any deal. And that means a certain amount of regulation by Brussels of British industries, with decisions about that regulation ultimately being decided by the European Court of Justice. The British have always said that they want to do this all by themselves. They want to regulate their own industries, set their own standards, and that they don't want that link to Brussels to continue, and that if it persists, then somehow that will still mean that Britain is connected to the European Union in some way. So those are the two big sticking issues. This has been the major cause of the quarrel. And the Europeans wanting the level playing field and some access to British waters, the British wanting neither. And this is what all the arguments over the last couple of weeks have been about.
Very, very interesting. Okay, so a couple of quick follow-up questions here. You were saying that this the issue of fishing and fishing rights is particularly emotive for the Brits. Is it primarily a motive, or how substantial is the economic end of things? And then following up, what are some of the key regulations that are themselves sticking points when it comes to industry in Britain?
Right. Let's deal with the fishing. I mean, one of the things is that, of course, 30 years ago, the fishing fleets in Britain were a very important industry. Large numbers of people were employed. And of course, because it's become converted from being a British industry into a European industry, that industry has essentially disappeared. There is that, I read somewhere, that there used to be about 150 trawlers, that's shipping boats, in a place like Grimsby 30 years ago, and now it's down to 4. So in terms of its economic importance, perhaps the answer is not very great. In terms of its emotional importance, it's huge. It simply cannot be underestimated. I think people in Berlin especially perhaps don't understand how important it is for the British, because it goes very much to their self-conception of themselves, of the British as an island nation, as a seafaring nation. British history is very connected to the sea, and of course, it's a very important aspect of their diet. So all of that was very important to their world and to their lifestyle. I can't on regulation. I think this is also extremely important for the British, in the sense that for the British.
Lost him for a bit. Alexander, is there anybody out there? Oh, there you are.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Now we can.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back on now.
How much did you lose?
Like maybe
just a couple of seconds there.
Seconds. Okay. Should I start on industries now and regulations?
That works.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
On the question of regulations, it's both important and emotive. Important because, of course, industries are all essentially regulated by Brussels if a country is within the European single market. It means, for example, that in the case of Britain, you have the British set their industries, set the standards of the industries. These are health and safety issues. These are quality issues. These are measurement issues, all those sort of things. They are set by Brussels, not by London. So to give just one example, after joining the European Union, Britain went from a situation where its measures became metric, where previously Britain had used imperial measures. Things of this kind. Now, nobody's suggesting that we go back to imperial measures instead of metric measures. But of course, it may affect other things also. So that is an important, again, an emotive issue for the British, but it's also an important economic one, because Britain is partly is involved in trade, and the cost of these regulatory measures is a serious one. So in terms of economics, it's the regulatory matters that really matter. In terms of emotion, it's the fishing ones.
I'm sorry, there we are. Are you ready for those chlorinated chickens that it's going to be coming to a store near you, in a supermarket near you? I'm curious, from the standpoint of the public, there's a bit of consternation around that, right? Like how, like I know the Brexit part in and of itself, but also where you guys are going to trade, what is going to be coming into the country, how is it going to change? Like, is the public, is there a certain frenzy around that? Is there a certain concern around that, even if there are going to be shortages based on a potential no deal, if just in case he sleepwalk into it?
Well, most definitely there is. And I think on the subject of chlorinated chicken, this is a major issue for many people here, actually. So, Britain has very high food safety standards, and also standards of treatment of animals. So, what they hear about the way chickens are reared in the United States, I mean, let's put it like this, upsets many British people. So this is actually another very emotive issue. And the answer is a lot of British people who were opposed to Brexit from the outset would be horrified by this. But I think the biggest issue for many Britons, including many Britons who voted for leave, is that, of course, if a deal with the United States, and it has to be ultimately the United States that is going to be the major trade partner if links with Europe are severed, the major concern is that this will lead to further steps towards breaking up the National Health Service, which for many British people remains the key, the most, thing that British people take the greatest pride in, and which they overwhelmingly support. Americans may find this difficult to understand, but the British are extremely passionate about their National Health Service and overwhelmingly support socialized medicine. And what they see about the way the health service system works in the United States, again, they're very hostile to. Now, the big question is, of course, if Britain can't do a trade deal with the United States, and its problems with Europe become very difficult, who does it trade with? And the answers are not very clear because, of course, you can trade with countries like Canada and Japan and China to some extent, although there are now growing problems about trading with China. But it becomes much more difficult, and Britain is a trading country.
Alexander, I hate to interrupt you, but let's do this. Let's take a break. I'm going to bring you back, and I'm going to let you finish. This is the voice you guys are hearing is Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief at Duran.com. We will be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief at Duran.com, and like I said, one of my favorite guests. You are talking about the NHS. I really want you to explain to the American audience the love that's there for the NHS. You guys, during the Olympics one year, did an ode to the NHS. It was beautiful. It was like the Winter Olympics. And, what Americans don't get is that when Medicare for All gets passed, when Social Security gets passed, and you look at those programs and you're like, wow, those programs have like 70, 80% approval. And it never occurs to them that, hey, programs that work and are popular, especially when they do something that is really, really good. And if you have Medicare for All passed, that the biggest fear of Democrats and Republicans is that they could never get rid of it. Every bit as much love that the Brits have for the NHS, Americans will have for whatever universal or Medicare for All healthcare system. And that is the real fear. Can you tell us the love that you guys have for the NHS and how it has been a benefit to the UK? And one more thing. When you guys first started the NHS, what was the result? Meaning, when it first happened, what was the actions, or how did the public respond to it when it was first initiated?
It was brought in the 1940s by the post-war Labour government, which was elected in 1945. And it was, right from the outset, the most popular measure that government introduced. Now, the interesting thing was that if you go back to the debates which happened in the 1940s, before it was introduced, you find that all the same arguments made, which are made against socialized medicine in the United States, were made in Britain. All the same parties were complaining about it. You had the free marketeers, you had a lot of the doctors who were doing very well by the old system. You had all those people saying, that this would be a disaster, that it'd be unaffordable, that it would create a crisis, that it was unfair, that it would create a massive bureaucracy. All of that was there. And then when it was introduced, it proved massively popular and hugely successful because, and this is the key thing, it meant that from that point onwards, British people, irrespective of their economic income, and that, by the way, includes middle-class people, were no longer worried about medical bills. They didn't have to take out hugely expensive insurance, and we were starting to move towards insurance-based systems in Britain in the 1940s. It created tremendous security, a very high degree of peace of mind. And of course, the other thing, and bear in mind, Britain is a relatively small country, certainly compared to the United States, it also made it possible for the British to maintain not just very high standards of healthcare, but very high standards of research, because it meant that medical research in Britain was, from that point on, backed by the government in a very direct way. So consultants, the actual, very high-end medical professionals, the kind of people who carry out research and who, examine, how to treat injuries and health problems, surgeons and people like that, they switched from being opponents of the system of socialized healthcare to becoming some of its most passionate supporters, and eventually that spread to all doctors too. So you're absolutely right. It is all but impossible to gain popular consent to dismantling this system. People say that it is the closest thing we have now in Britain to a national religion. There is massive opposition to undermining it. There are still some people who criticize it, and you still find many opponents. And if you read right-wing newspapers like The Telegraph, you will constantly find some people there grumbling and complaining about it. But popular support for it remains rock solid, and any political party, including a Conservative Party, that threatens to dismantle it has no political future in Britain. Even Boris Johnson, who, is on the sort of, more right-wing side of the Conservative Party, has said that he will protect the NHS. So did Margaret Thatcher. And, of course, one of the most powerful claims that the Leavers made during the Brexit referendum is that money that was not sent to Brussels would be spent instead on supporting the NHS. So you're absolutely right. Once it's done, it's extremely difficult to undo. It isn't quite the same NHS that was created in the 1940s. The Conservatives, who I have always had a group, a faction that has disliked it because they don't like state solutions, have always worked from the inside to try and undermine it. They introduced internal markets into it. They've tried to, chip away at some of its more socialistic features. But overall, and by and large, it remains massively popular, and it costs only a fraction of what you spend on your health system in the United States. It's proved to be a very good way of containing health costs.
Very interesting. We only have so much time. I'm going to change subjects now, actually, fairly rapidly to another part of the EU. At least it's a rather controversial statement these days, of course, with Brexit ongoing. Isn't true anymore. But over to Greece, where I saw that you at the Duran were having a conversation about austerity and upcoming economic crisis. Why do you see this happening? What do you see happening? And just give us a brief backdrop on what has happened over the past decade in Greece broadly. I know that's a larger conversation, but in a couple of minutes, Alexander.
Well, very briefly, Greece has an extremely lopsided economy. Before Greece joined the EU at the end of the 1980s, it was a country that was gradually industrializing. I mean, not in a massive way. You're never going to get big Greek companies, but there was some industrialization. Its agriculture was developing in a certain sort of way. What happened after it joined the EU is that its industries basically stopped functioning because they couldn't compete with those of Germany, Italy, and France. A vast amount of money poured into agriculture. And of course, at the same time, it became a service economy, one over-dependent on tourism. And that created a very lopsided economy with low productivity and a very, very large trade deficit. And in the end, a very big budget deficit too. So it made up the difference by getting into very heavy debt. After the 2008 crisis, it found it couldn't pay those debts. It was then forced into ever deeper austerity by the European Union in order to pay those debts. That hasn't really worked. We've now had the pandemic. That's exacerbated the problems even further because the productive side of the economy, which is based on services and tourism, is the part of the economy which has been affected even more. So the result is that the budget deficit and the trade deficit and the overall level of debt is growing again as the economy is contracting. And the lopsided nature of the economy is getting worse with no clear sign from Brussels or Athens about what they're going to do about it. So the likelihood is at the end of this process, we're going to see yet another period of austerity imposed on Greece on top of the ones that we had previously. And that period of renewed austerity will make the problems of the economy even greater.
That is so disturbing. I mean, I don't know if people remember, they shut their banks down. I mean, they literally didn't have money after the referendum. Who's in power now for Greece? I mean, at one point it was Syria. Syria, is that the name? It's I think I'm saying it wrong.
Syriza. It's actually
Syriza. That's it.
Syriza. But now the party that's in power is called New Democracy, which is a bizarre name. It's basically a conservative oligarch family run by the established old families that have been running Greece for basically the last 100 years. Deeply corrupt because that's the nature of the political system. And intensely pro-EU. I mean, they basically follow whatever line Brussels and Berlin and Frankfurt set for them. And the point about Syriza is that it did try, however briefly, to try to break out of this, this trap. It sought to try to, move away from repaying debt, start to reactivate the economy by more spending, trying to rebalance the economy by strengthening its productive side. But of course, it fell foul of the European Union, which, as you said, imposed all those restrictions and basically closed down the Greek banks. And the result is that we've ended up with a pro-EU, conservative, corrupt, oligarchical government. There's no real vision about what to do, and doesn't even really understand the problems very well, I suspect.
You know what? In our last couple of minutes, I'm going to do another pivot here. In about a minute and a half, Alexander, what is your take on the allegations of hacking on both sides of the Atlantic? First, in the U.S. with the allegations that Russia specifically has hacked into a wide variety at this point, including now some people are saying the Department of Energy, our national nuclear stockpile, that they have hacked into our services. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, institutional hacking with a sort of slightly under-discussed report that I saw you talking about the other day, that the Chinese government has hacked into various institutions, putting people into key positions of power. What's your take on both of those in about a minute here, Alexander?
But first of all, I mean, we don't really know who was behind the big American hack, but to me, it looks more like a massive demonstration of power, of cyber, skill and effectiveness by one of the great powers that the United States is targeting. That points clearly, to my mind, to China and Russia. The US has talked happily about, putting cyber bombs in other countries, like Russia especially. Whoever did this is saying to the United States, if you go down that road, we can do to you and more whatever you are threatening to do to us. And at the same time, this other story about, the Chinese hacking and all that, it shows the extent to which cyber warfare is now completely out of control and is being waged all the time. What needs to happen
15
is an international agreement to control this thing. Russia has
Sadly, I don't see that happening. We're going to have to come back to that conversation some other time. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of The Duran, thank you for joining us. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back in just a minute with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to some headlines, because I kind of want to get back and I want Shane to answer full-throatedly in the question that came up in the monologue. In the news, at least 3,293 new coronavirus deaths and 238,189 new cases were reported in the United States on December 17th. Let me repeat that. These numbers are getting obscene. At least 3,293 new coronavirus deaths and 238,189 new cases were reported in the United States on December 17th. Over the past week, there's been an average of 213,165 cases per day, an increase of 18% from average 2 weeks earlier. A panel of outside advisors to the United States Food and Drug Administration on Thursday endorsed emergency use of Moderna's Inc. coronavirus vaccine. This comes 1 week after the same panel backed a similar vaccine from Pfizer and BioNTech, leading to an FDA emergency use authorization a day earlier. The FDA is expected to grant Moderna an EUA as early as late Friday. Brazil's Supreme Court has ruled that Brazilians are required to be vaccinated against COVID-19 under the penalty of being banned from certain public activities and spaces. 10 justices of the 11-member court backed the mandatory inoculation with only one vote against in virtual session held Thursday. The ruling is a blow to President Jair Bolsonaro, who has said that he won't get a vaccine and nobody should be forced to. Wow. Shane, what do you think about that? I mean, this is a right-wing government. What was the justification of trying to argue that the country should be forcibly inoculated? Don't get me wrong. I am one of those people that agree that something should be done about the virus. Clearly, I've been one of those people that have been pushing for the science of the mask and all this other stuff. But I have deep and abiding qualms with this. Let's do this. Let's come back to this one because, like I said, I want to finish it to give you a full-throated conversation. The Energy Department and National Nuclear Security Administration, which maintains the United States nuclear weapons stockpile, report that they have evidence that the hackers assessed their networks as part of an extensive espionage operation that had affected at least half a dozen federal agencies, officials directly familiar with the matter said. On Thursday, the DOE and the NNSA officials began coordinating notifications about the breach to their congressional oversight bodies after being briefed by Rocky Campione, the chief information officer at the DOE. President-elect Joe Biden chose Representative Deb Haaland, the New Mexico's 1st congressional district, on Thursday to serve as the first Native American cabinet secretary and head the Interior Department, a pick that marks a turning point for the United States' relationship with the nation's indigenous peoples. Haaland is chair of the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. Representative Justin Amash yesterday introduced a bill to end civil asset forfeiture, which allows government to take property from someone without ever charging them for a crime. Known as Civil Asset Forfeiture Elimination Act, Amash states that it would, quote, repeal civil asset forfeiture nationwide, unquote, sharing the text of the bill in a series of tweets sent Thursday afternoon. Yes, like, basically the cops can take your property away from you. You don't have to have committed a crime. Nothing. You don't even have to be charged. You don't even have to be taken to jail. I am making the point to you that this is obscene. And I understand that supposedly this was used for drug dealers and everything else, but at the end of the day, this is not the way our law should work. If you're not charged with a crime, the last thing you should have is cops stealing your property. More than 300 schoolboys kidnapped in northern Nigeria were handed over to the government security, the Katsina state governor said in a televised interview. The boys, whose abduction was claimed by Islamist militant group Boko Haram in an unverified audio recording, have now arrived back in Katsina. The number of civilians forced from their homes by conflict in northern Mozambique has quadrupled this year to 420,000, according to the United Nations, which links to crisis in Cabo Delgado province, not just to attacks by Islamist militants, but to perceived failures to distribute vast mineral and offshore gas revenues to the local population. France will return 27 colonial artifacts held in museums to Benin and Senegal within 1 year. This follows a unanimous vote by the National Assembly yesterday. Overriding late opposition from the Senate, the National Assembly gave its final approval to a restitution bill transferring ownership of the 26 plundered royal artifacts from the Musée des Quai Branly Jacques Chirac to the Republic of Benin, and a sword from the Army Museum of Senegal. So this is interesting. When I was abroad, I was having a conversation with somebody there, and they were pointing out that there were artifacts that had been taken from various countries, and that basically every year they request to have them back, and every year they're told no. So it's interesting that France is doing this. Pierre Buyoya, the former president of Burundi, who twice seized power in military coups and oversaw prolonged ethnic civil war, killed 300,000 of his countrymen, has died at 71, the government announced on Friday. He died in Mali from the coronavirus. There are just a few hours left for the UK and the EU to agree to a post-Brexit trade deal, says Michael Barnier, the French politician serving as the European Commission's head of the task force for relations with the United Kingdom. Speaking in the European Parliament on Friday, the EU's chief negotiator said it was, quote, the moment of truth, unquote, for the two sides to come to an agreement. He said there's still a chance, quote, unquote, of a deal, but the path is very narrow. The comments follow a warning for Boris Johnson that a no-deal scenario was very likely unless the EU position changed substantially. Look, guys, this is brinksmanship. Boris Johnson, if you look back at what he's done just in the past of the last 4 years, he has done this tactic over and over and over again. Oftentimes, I'd be dead in a ditch if, we don't have this done by that date. He was not dead in a ditch, and he did get an extension. Just saying. Colorado's Attorney General filed a lawsuit yesterday against Google, along with the Attorney Generals of 37 other states, alleging that the tech giant is engaging in anti-competitive conduct in violation of Section 2 of the Sherman Act. In a press release, the Attorney General Phil Weiser said, quote, the states allege that Google illegally maintains its monopoly power over general search engines and related general search advertising markets through a series of anti-competitive contracts and conduct, unquote. This comes literally one day after Texas Attorney General led the attorneys. I'm sorry, let me try that one more time. This comes literally after one day. This literally comes one day after Texas Attorney General led the attorney generals of 9 other states to file a similar lawsuit against Google, and comes after the Department of Justice also sued Google back in October, similarly alleging anti-competitive and unfair practices. China's Chang'e 5 moon probe has landed in Inner Mongolia. China's ZU news agency has reported completing its return and bringing back the first lunar samples to the Earth since 1970s. The return capsule touched down at about 2 a.m. local time and made China the third country to have retrieved lunar samples after the United States and the Soviet Union, who 44 years ago launched the last successful missions to retrieve samples. Yesterday, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged the stock trading app Robinhood with, quote, misleading customers about revenue sources and failing to satisfy duty of best execution, unquote, tacking on a $65 million fine. My wife uses that app, so it's good to know. A joint team of scientists have transmitted qubits of photons, single units of light, basically across 40 kilometers of fiber optic cable, using state-of-the-art low-noise superconducting nanowire, single photon detectors, and off-the-shelf optics. Scientists at Fermilab, AT&T, Caltech, Harvard University, the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and University of Calgary said the process they've experimentally verified here could provide a realistic foundation for a high-fidelity quantum internet with practical devices. The Caltech and Fermilab team plans to build a city-scale network called the Illinois Express Quantum Network in Chicago next, although this will be experimental and a far cry from the gigabit internet. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So I wanted to come back. We have a few minutes, and maybe we can pick this up in the next segment. But I wanted to come back to the monologue. This notion that our world, our society, is basically heading for a reset. And that reset may not necessarily be the way that the right-wingers are talking about, but it does seem to be hitting this kind of inflection point where machines and robots take over many of the certain jobs, especially dealing with power and electricity and vital services, whereas human beings get eliminated from those jobs. And I'm making the point that the public consciousness hadn't gotten to the point yet of reconciling that reality. And it may get to the point where we don't reconcile that until it's too late, when large swaths of people are out of work, where all of the revenue or a huge share of the revenue goes to the top. To point this out right now, under Obama, 95% of the income went to the top 1%. I guarantee you that number is going to be higher under Trump. And in a situation, in a dystopian world that I am pointing to, it will get worse still. Our power is edging away as our ability to strike edges away. Shane, I'm going to give this to you. Let's do this. Do you want to take a break and you bring it back in and start from there, and we can take calls and everything else from that point on?
I'll do that. I'll probably call for calls a couple of minutes into the segment just so we have time to talk and so that we don't keep folks on the line, hoping without getting into it. One quick breaking news update, though. Vice President Pence and his wife, Karen Pence, just got the vaccine shots on TV live. So I was just watching, this is maybe 5-6 minutes ago at this point, just watching back on that on YouTube. So that's happened. Just a quick breaking news update. In any event, we're going into a break right now. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break in just a minute. Or at least I think we will. Andre?
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're having a conversation. In a couple of minutes, we'll be taking calls. But let's just get straight back into this conversation. Jamarl, you were talking earlier in your monologue about a couple of things. You're talking about automation and the sort of various aspects of a dystopic future that we could be heading into. You kind of set this conversation off, by bringing up the Great Reset and how, while you don't necessarily buy into the sort of the worst fever dream fantasies of folks who are looking at this thing, you nevertheless do see components of it that are a little bit scary. And broadly, you're worried about some aspects of the future. Is that fair to say?
Perfect explanation. I love that. You know, it's funny. I've been dealing with this kind of back and forth where you would explain something and people don't get your explanation. People ignore the explanation. People ignore every other part of it and can't articulate it fairly. And so I love the fact that in having this conversation, you can articulate the point of view. So, okay, this is the position that the person is having and nail it straightforward. So thank you, Shane. I appreciate it.
Of course, man. Thank you. No, sometimes it's good to be able to do that.
Yes.
Sometimes I fail at that, but it's you try to focus on that as a skill. Anyway,
you do tend
helps.
to try more than others. So take that as a good thing.
Thank you. Usually it helps to not piss people off when you're getting into some kind of conversation with them, whether it's polite or like impolite. Usually, if you can represent what they say, then you're off to a good start. Anyway, here's the thing, man. I'm pretty worried about it too. I'm not too particularly concerned about the Great Reset thing, simply because the people who are doing it, as far as I can tell, they're the same stagnant players that have held power for decades. And it's admittidly the world has shifted. But if you compare, for instance, the period between like 1880 and 1950, that 70-year long period, and then you compare that one with the period between, say, 1950 and 2020, another 70-year long period, I would argue that there were more fundamental changes in the structure of our society, in our ideology, in our convictions during that first period than there were during the second, in a weird way. Now, the rhetoric is about the sort of, at least the rhetoric among some people, is about like, this sort of weirdly singularitarian, like a politically singularitarian argument that we're headed into this political moment. On the other side of that, we're going to come out fundamentally different, in a fundamentally worse place, disempowered, whether it's by talking about biology and the biological sciences and genetic engineering and stuff, or whether you're talking about engineering and the automation of industry and artificial intelligence. I think there are a lot of very good points to be made there, and I am worried about a lot of those elements too. But at the same time, if you look back at the last century or so, if you look back at propaganda, if you look back at major changes in how our society works and how it's owned, who it's owned by, the concentration of wealth, inequality, and such, we've already gone through a couple of singularities. And admittedly, those have changed us in some ways for the worse, and I don't want to try to discount that. But we also come through the other side more or less intact. Now, one of the things you were saying in your monologue that I want to come back to that I think is pretty interesting, you said something about religion or spirituality. I wasn't recording it, but I don't remember exactly what you said, but it was something like we're spiritually adrift, something like this, that what we need is a sort of fundamental change in our outlook.
Yeah, I do think people, kind of Maslow's theory of needs, basically that in addition to kind of the physical aspects of things that we require for life in order to exist, we also have this kind of conceptual world that needs to be fulfilled. And that's this kind of belonging, and not being alienated from the society. Like if you look at, for example, when Wisconsin, let's take Wisconsin, you had Jacob Blake get shot by that cop. Now you had all of the protesting, you had everybody angry, upset, and many people placed it entirely and squarely on Blake. But I would make the point that if Blake was the only person that got killed, the protest never happened. And I would even go so far as if there was some level of accountability, or if those areas weren't as impoverished as they were, there would not have been that march. Many of the Wisconsin areas, I think the overwhelming majority black population areas, were mostly prisons or jails. And so it's like, that's Wisconsin, and those are the areas that are mostly full of African Americans. And so it's like, yeah, I guess, if you're looking at the poverty level and it's that obscene, and you're looking at the area where housing and it's basically prisons, then I can kind of understand how there will be a certain amount of anger and alienation from the larger society. That's kind of what I mean. Just this notion that you need to have people to feel that they're a part of it, because if you don't, they're going to feel like they're against it, and it creates strife. That's all I meant by that. I guess that is a spiritual element of sorts. So yeah, I can accept that.
I can see that. Yeah, I mean, partly. So here's the thing: I'm not a particularly religious person. I have, I like to read some certain religious texts, but I don't subscribe to a religion. So what I'm about to say might sound a little bit weird, having said that, but the sort of fundamental separation of church and the state, I would say, puts a weird, deep hamper on your ability, any government's ability, or any society, frankly, any society's ability to redress the spiritual needs of that society. It seems to me like in the modern era, the closest thing that we have to a religion is, in large part, is the deeper sort of social justice movement thing going on right now, in a weird way, where a lot of the arc of history and how you can draw that by pursuing justice is drawn in terms of shaping the lines of oppression and oppressed, to try to reshape those to make everybody better off in the future. Now, I want to be empathetic, because in some ways I totally empathize with this, and I totally can see the upside of this. On the other hand, I don't think that's a suitable spiritual replacement for what we fundamentally want and need, which is, a vision of society that can both help us to redress our deep wounds and our deep needs, and hold society together in the long run. It seems like the way that social justice, the way that whole movement is going, is deeply divisive, and it's only getting more divisive in our society. And I don't know. I mean, that's admittedly controversial. I kind of actually want to say that, leave that there. And, anybody who disagrees with that can disagree with that, but then move back to the issue of automation and AI for a second before we go to calls here. What I'm worried about, man, and you were touching on this yourself, it's the value of individual human beings going down as either mechanically or intellectually we are replaced by automated thought and action, by the automation of certain services, for instance, like you were talking about, people walking up to houses and leaving packages in front of doors. A robot can certainly do that, but thinking in different ways, whether it's literally everything from programming to jurisprudence to creative writing, AI is very quickly getting to the point where it can do that more effectively in many cases than most people. And it might get to the point fairly quickly where it can do that more effectively than any person. In other words, a wholesale replacement of human potential with artificial systems that do it a lot better. And where does that leave the value of any human being on the other side of that? I don't know, man. I don't think anybody does. A lot of people are thinking about this stuff. Not enough people in positions of power are asking these questions. And the problem, as far as I can tell, is that, what we're looking at as a great reset. Anybody in power who starts to ask these questions, whether they're doing a good job or a bad job, whether they're wise or not, is going to come under everybody's scrutiny. And I don't think they're going to make any progress, because we're also suspicious, rightfully, of power and what power does. Am I making any sense here, Jamarl?
There we are. You are making sense. Yeah, you're making perfect sense. That basically, because of discrediting of our world of sorts, of infrastructure and everything else, and I don't think it's people's fault per se, trying to deal with this gets cast as being part of it. It's like, exactly. It's like the very cure is the thing that people think is the illness. And that makes it...
I don't blame them for it.
No, I don't blame them either. But it's still a quagmire. Like if somebody comes and says, hey, we need to get a UBI because basically technology is taking the jobs and everything else, we need to make sure people can take care of themselves. Now, that person can come from a good place. That person could be not thinking about this other stuff, and they will get labeled as a resetter. And that's unfortunate because it's like you need to be able to have this conversation because this is coming one way or the other, meaning from the standpoint of technology. Let's take everything out, like from the good, bad, and everything else. The technology thing is coming. Look, value is not an absolute, right? Like it's one of those things that people can value pretty much anything for any particular reason. It's entirely subjective. It's not an absolute at all, even though people tend to act like it is. If value is not an absolute, what is the value of a human being? Well, again, value is not absolute. And the problem is our value is oftentimes tethered to whatever job we can do. So if you're a fry cook, okay, that guy is a fry cook. And that value somehow is attributed to the job, even going so far as when you meet somebody, say, hey, what do you do? Because the job in and of itself gives you almost like an idea of the quantity of the individual. But also, I would argue, how much they're worth, regardless of the society never admitting that. Meaning society would never admit that human beings have value. They would say, yes, human beings are priceless, human beings are valuable, but they don't treat human beings like that in this society or else. If this human beings were indeed valuable, the fight for healthcare doesn't happen. It's implicit. It goes without saying. Or making sure that when somebody gets older, that they don't die in destitution, that they have a life of dignity. Well, again, if that was true, that would be assumed, and it's not. And so my concern is if value is tethered to the value of the individual and labor gets undermined, what does it mean for people? Like, I think we do need to have this conversation, and we do need to, like Andrew Yang tried. But Andrew Yang, the problem with it is they want to basically just give people money. I want people to have control of the means of production. And there's a vast difference in those things. What do you think,
agree.
Shane?
Like I was saying earlier, universal basic means of production. You know what, though? We should take calls. Let's leave it on that cliffhanger maybe and come back to it either later in the show or some other day next week, perhaps, if you're down. We have a caller on the line. Tarif calling in from New Orleans. You're on the line. What's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I have 3 comments. 2 of them are going to relate to each other. Kamala Harris, I found out something about her I didn't know. But in San Francisco, when she was the Attorney General, she stopped cooperating with some victims of some Catholic priests. Her office had files on some big priest that was abusing children, and that could have helped out the victims, to pursue the Catholic Church with a lawsuit or whatnot. And also, my second comment dealing with her, that she asked a judge to deny Sirhan, the assassin, one of the supposedly assassin of Robert F. Kennedy, appeal. She asked the judge to stop the appeal because there wasn't no new evidence. But his lawyer said it was new evidence because he came up with audio saying there was 13 shots instead of 8 shots. So she blocked that, dealing with Sirhan. And my last comment, there were ties into it, that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said it was Thing Eugene Caesar that worked at the hotel, that also worked at Lockheed Martin, which his unit had ties to the CIA, with the Black Budget Program, that he think it was that man that killed his father was named Thing Eugene Caesar, which he died in the Philippines at the age of 77. And he think Sirhan was a MK Ultra taxi to take the fall for his father's death. And if Trump can release the files, whatever files they got in the archives on Robert F. Kennedy assassination, then maybe we can find out what's going on with that. Why did Kamala Harris stop that in the first place in California? They should at least give that man an appeal so we can find out who if they have any other assassins. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say today.
Tarif, thank you for the call. Interesting call and interesting lead as always. And by the way, I just want to, come back to this at some other point. Need to do some research. Interesting research you're doing on Kamala Harris. But by the way, your calls for Trump to pardon Julian Assange, I'm not sure if they're going to come to pass, but you certainly seem to be having some effect here. I'm not sure if it's actually you, but we'll see. With that specifically, he didn't call into it today, but for those listening, Tarif from New Orleans usually calls in, and it's like his thing is calling for Trump to pardon Julian Assange.
They asked Trump about that.
There's been movement on that.
They asked Trump about that and Snowden. And Trump is like, well, people on the left and on the right really want these guys pardoned, so I'm going to think about it. And it's like, dude, what are you thinking about?
Giuliani? You saw
no,
Giuliani
Donald Trump was asked about it. I mean, one of the reporters asked Donald Trump.
But did you see the Giuliani clip?
No, I haven't seen the Giuliani clip. What was the Giuliani one?
Yeah, he's being interviewed on Fox, and he's coming out and defending Julian Assange. He's defending WikiLeaks. He's saying, they're a publisher of information. If you go back and look at the Pentagon Papers, all these news organizations, all these news outlets publish the Pentagon Papers. Well, how's WikiLeaks any different for publishing, quote unquote, stolen papers? The Pentagon Papers were stolen. He's making this point. He's defending Assange. So it's coming out of Trump's wing, certainly. And again, that was primetime Fox. Anyway, we've got to go into a break here, but there is movements on that. And
just real quick, they did try to prosecute Daniel Ellsberg for those. They tried.
It's true, man. Yeah, this stuff is weird.
Mike Gravel read him out in Congress. Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm sorry. Yeah, let's go to a break.
And we're going into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break with Laith Marouf. But again, that's in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from Washington, D.C., from our station in D.C. Guys, joining us is Laith Marouf, award-winning multimedia producer and media policy law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonialization from indigenous communities or from indigenous nations to Arab peoples, and building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. Laith, welcome back to the show, man. How's it going?
Good. It's always great to be on your show, guys.
Absolutely. So you want to have a conversation about the deal that Israel has just signed. And there's something else. Report came out that Donald Trump was basically trying to get the Sudan, and then maybe you could talk about this. He was trying to basically get the money that the Sudan gave the United States, or gave Trump, to pay the families off so they would drop the lawsuit, if I'm not mistaken. Were you aware of this story? That he was basically trying to bribe the families of the Sudan so he can get involved in a relationship with Sudan. Were you aware of this one?
Yes. Obviously, Sudan was just dropped off the state sponsoring terrorism list that the United States keeps. It was already, outrageous to have Sudan there, but they were shaken down by the United States. And part of that deal was that they will normalize with apartheid Israel. And now, given that the United States got what it wants from Sudan, the lawsuit on behalf of the victims of terrorism in the United States that was lodged against Sudan is now under pressure by Trump to drop it because they've already been shaken down for their money. There's no need for more, it seems like.
So let's get to the deal. So what is the latest deal that was signed by Israel? It seems that Donald Trump is basically trying to... It's very strange. He's leaving office, but he's still trying to get these deals made. What do you think his motivation is in trying to get these deals made, despite the fact that he's leaving office? Do you think it's just legacy? Do you think it's like, because what's his motivation at this point to do this?
Well, it's hard to tell what is the exact motivation, but if we, briefly look at the relationship between the monarchies in the Arab world that have been always vessels of Western powers, protected through the age of the decolonization, by the British and the French and the Americans. The only reason they're still monarchies like Morocco and the Gulf states. It seems like Trump is trying to lift the veil off the relationship behind the doors between these monarchies and apartheid Israel, and kind of pegging these monarchies to the reality of their collaboration with apartheid Israel, and make it impossible for them to have double speak. On the one hand, work with apartheid Israel behind the scenes to undermine Palestinian liberation, to undermine Arab unification, while at the same time pretending to be, protectors of Arab national aspirations and or Islam in the case of Saudi Arabia. So the latest deal was between Morocco and apartheid Israel, and it was an exchange between these two states of recognition of their occupied territories. So the United States recognized now the Western Sahara as a part of Morocco. In return, Morocco acknowledged apartheid Israel and its control over Palestine, normalizing relations. So, it's scratch my back, I scratch yours situation. It is a very dangerous situation in this case because unlike, normalization that happened with Gulf states, this could be triggering a regional war because the Western Sahara being on the border of Algeria and Mauritania and Mali, and what that could lead into military confrontation around them.
Well, that's really interesting. It is the population itself, because I would imagine, just like many of the other Gulf states, there's a distinction in opinion between, let's say, the royalty. Let's say there's like a class distinction or a class difference between, let's say, the royalty, who might not actually see an issue with working with Israel, but may do so behind the scenes because it doesn't necessarily want to deal with the anger of its population directed at the ruling class or the government itself. Morocco's case is really interesting, though, because they are basically legitimizing Israel's claim to somebody else's land in exchange for, basically the United States doing the same. How does the population of Morocco, meaning the population itself, versus the government in regards to the point of view? I would imagine the population is not happy with this.
Yes, I mean, the latest opinion polls in the Arab world in regards to normalization with apartheid Israel shows that Algeria is the most anti-apartheid Israel, like 98% of the population refuse that. Morocco comes second, and so something around 92% of the population is against this normalization. So we know that millions of people in Morocco come out in the streets every year for supporting Palestine and against the crimes of apartheid Israel. But we have a situation right now where the sentiments of the Moroccan public are being tugged in two ways. On the one hand, they are being told that if you don't support this, then you're not supporting sovereignty of Morocco over the Western Sahara. So the nationalist sentiments of the Moroccans are being triggered. But at the same time, they're being told they have to give up on Palestine and Jerusalem. And this is something that will have an internal conflict in Morocco itself. A few days ago, two very famous Moroccan activists, one of them being a lawyer, a human rights lawyer that's very famous in the country, and the other, an anti-Zionist Jewish Moroccan, very famous also. They both tried to, and they're elders, they're in their 70s. They try to start their own vigil outside the parliament in Morocco, and hundreds of police and security services descended on the scene and roughed them up and pushed them away from the scene. So we can see already that there's a trigger of internal conflict that's going to happen in Morocco over this, added to the fact that Algeria could enter Western Sahara militarily to support the liberation of that land. And so, we wonder how much the king of Morocco and or his minions have thought this out, because it could end up leading to their dethroning.
Well, okay, so a couple of quick follow-up questions here. One, do we have any access to polling data or some other indicative signal of popular support in Morocco for the king and what he's been doing there recently, and just in general for the government? And then number two, are you suggesting that Algeria could choose to embroil themselves in a war, or would this be sort of proxy support, for Western Sahara? What do you see happening there, Laith?
So in terms of popular opinion polls, the latest, as I was speaking to you before, is an opinion poll that was conducted by the Arab Studies Institute in Qatar. And it showed, something around 92% of Moroccans are against normalization with apartheid Israel. So it is one of the highest percentages in the whole Arabic world. So definitely Moroccans are pro-Palestinian. They look forward for the liberation of Palestine. And you could see it always in their soccer, football games, Moroccan fans. The game will be just an internal league game, and suddenly they'll break out into song for Palestine, and they'll pull out the Palestinian flags. And so it is very dangerous to kind of presume that the Moroccan population will be silent as their king sells Palestine. And this is very sensitive because the king and the royal family of Morocco claim to be descendants of the Prophet Muhammad and call themselves Alawites. So part of their legitimacy in existence is being supposedly protectors of Islam and Arab rule. And in this case, also Morocco sits as the coordinator, the chair of the Jerusalem Protection Committee within the Arab League. So here you have Morocco and its king giving up on their, on the only reason that they're royals, and also giving up on their duty to be the chairs of the Jerusalem Committee. And as far as we're talking about Algeria and the Western Sahara, Algeria has always been the main supporter of the Western Sahara Liberation Front, the Polisario, the main funder and weapon supplier for them. And we have to remember that the Western Sahara Liberation Front and the struggle there didn't start out of nowhere. There was, prior to that, a liberation movement in Morocco against the royal family protected by Spain and France and Israel and the United States. and Western intelligence agencies in the 50s helped the Moroccan royalty to liquidate, literally with acid, hundreds of Moroccan rebels and intellectuals that were looking for the end of one monarchy and a democratic rule. And when that failed, that's when the Sahara, being still under Spanish rule at the time, began a movement of its own for liberation. And then that's when Spain gave back the Sahara to the Moroccans to help them kind of suppress this movement. So the underlying reason for having a Western Sahara Liberation Front is not just to cut that territory away from Moroccan control, but to actually bring down the vassal monarchy.
Let's go into a break. We are joined for this segment and the next by Laith Marouf, award-winning multimedia producer and media policy and law consultant. We'll be back with Laith in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Laith Marouf. He is an award-winning multimedia producer and media policy and law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples, and focused on building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. And by the way, you can follow Laith on Twitter at Laith Marouf, and it's spelled Laith Marouf. You can also check out his website cmacenter.org, and that is center spelled the British way, CENTRE.org, cmacenter.org. Laith, thank you again for being with us. Just generally speaking, I got two sort of larger questions here, and maybe we'll only have time for one of them. It seems to me that the dynamic is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the monarchs have great incentive in a lot of cases to work with Israel. But the populations, by and large, in many of these countries are set against that. How do you see that dynamic playing out? Do you see, in other words, say 92% of Moroccans are opposed to a reconciliation with Israel, but the King of Morocco is benefiting from it because, of course, Israel, like you're saying, is recognizing Moroccan possession of most of Western Sahara. So it's to his advantage in some sense to get more legitimacy by having Israel recognize it. But it's a monarchy. It's not a democracy. It's not the case that in a couple of years he's going to get voted out of office because the public's upset with him and somebody else is going to be put into power. And of course, that also holds true for many of these other countries. Like you're saying, many of these countries are monarchies. Everyone that we've spoken about so far is a monarchy. Of what relevance to the kings is public opinion? How do you see that playing out in the long run? Laith?
Well, two things. If the Western powers for 1 second stop supporting these monarchies now or any time since the 1900s, since the early 1900s, those monarchies will collapse and would have, these countries would have not only turned into democracies, parliamentary democracies, but also would have unified with the remainder of the Arabic world. So we know that these monarchies know that their fate and their survival depends on being in full servitude of the Western powers. And you could see that, for instance, how Trump was shaking down the Saud family and the other Gulf royalties and humiliating them publicly while he's doing that. And you saw how these monarchies did still give anything that Trump won because they have no choice. If they actually stand against Western imperialism and apartheid Israel, and either the United States will flip them over and appoint another monarch in charge, or they will collapse and be merged with Arab unification. So their survival depends on being servants of the West. So this is how we see it. And I know that maybe what happened in the 1940s and 50s, the decolonization age, didn't succeed in these countries. But there is this amber under the ash that is at any moment could set fire. And the more boldly these monarchs work as vessels without shame, the closer the fire is going to be set.
Laith, explain something to me for a moment. So Donald Trump is continuing basically the killings. The Soleimani, the nuclear scientists, there were also multiple people that, lesser known names that were being taken out in these various airstrikes or these various hits. Israel has been accused, and the United States have basically been accused in some of the other ones. Now, Iran has basically said there will be consequences for these murders, for all intents and purposes. Might as well call them what they are. And as there will be consequences, I have to assume that because Donald Trump is continuing to bring countries together with Israel, that despite the fact that he lost, it means that he probably still is working for the interests of Israel in this other capacity. I guess my point is, the fact that he is doing this in one avenue means he's also probably doing it in the other avenue. Biden was in the administration when the JCPOA was signed. Now, Rouhani, yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, president, basically made the point that says Joe Biden will undoubtedly come back to the JCPOA. Now, which one is it? Is it possible that the reason that Trump and Iran are taking these provocative actions now is because they basically want to get Iran to respond in a way that will force Joe Biden to behave abruptly when he gets into office, or force a conflict right off the bat, even if it's from the standpoint of Iran not wanting to work with the United States because of what was taking place? In the elections that are coming up, is Rouhani going to win? Or is a hardliner going to get the tally or get the vote? And how are they minding that? I mean, if he's saying Biden is going to come back to the JCPOA, but they're also saying there's going to be consequences for it, how are both of those things congruent?
So, today also the chair of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who was appointed by Trump, a few years ago, came out saying that they have to renegotiate the JCPOA. So what does that mean is that we're seeing clearly that the United States is not going to come back into the nuclear agreement. We already heard some of Biden's team already speaking about wanting to add to the agreement the issues of Iran's long-range missiles and its regional policies. And we heard on the other side from Iran saying that they're not willing to renegotiate anything, that the United States can come back into the agreement as is, and then Iran will follow through with its own obligations. So, hearing Rouhani say that in the past few days, we also saw a huge backlash in Iran against him taking that position, because any logical person who's reading the news can see that the United States will not return to the same agreement. That if Rouhani tries to go that path again, he will be wasting another 4 years of Iran's development on a bird on the tree, not in the hand. So it is very expected that Rouhani will lose the electoral election coming up in Iran because of those assassinations, because of the intransigence of the United States, and a more hardliners will get in power in the presidency. Everybody is expecting a war to come very soon in the region, and the response of Iran is most probably going to trigger it, and they probably are waiting for Biden to be fully in power before they respond to the assassinations.
What shape do you see that war taking? I mean, who do you see sitting on either side, and what type of event would you think would set that off, Laith?
I'm not sure what target Iran will choose to respond to the assassinations. So there's two of them. One of them having to be the assassination of Fakhrizadeh, the head of the nuclear program of Iran, and that Israel is responsible for, and the other is Soleimani's assassination, and that is the United States is responsible for. So if they choose to respond to apartheid Israel's assassination of Fakhrizadeh, then it will definitely lead to a direct confrontation between the whole axis of resistance, including Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And similarly, if they decide to first respond to the assassination of Soleimani by hitting an American target, again, on the other side, this is part of what Trump was rushing with this. He's really building an open military alliance between the Gulf monarchies and apartheid Israel, which was already there, but now it's open, this alliance. And, the biggest losers in any coming war will be those Gulf monarchies, with their glass towers that are going to be shattered very easily.
So basically, the Gulf monarchies are kept in power because of their association with the United States. They can buy weapons, they get support. And you're making the point that if Rouhani loses, and so let me ask this, what would a hardliner do that Rouhani wouldn't? If you know what I'm getting at. Like, so for any particular situation, let's say you have two people, or let's say you have multiple people. One person says, I'm going to do X. The next person says, I'm going to do Y. The next person says, I'm going to do Z. And each of these have a certain outcome. What would Rouhani do, or what would a hardliner do differently than Rouhani? And like, for example, a Soleimani, or let's say the nuclear scientist. What would have been the reaction of a hardliner in those situations beyond rhetoric?
So I would presume that if a hardliner comes into power, their immediate response would be open deployments of Iranian troops in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen. Up until now, Iran has only deployed military advisors in Syria. It has been helping maybe smuggle some of the technology that it has to Yemen, but has not been involved in the war there. Similarly, in Iraq, it has been trying to always find a halfway between, an engagement of co-rule with the United States over Iraq, allowing some of the U.S. Puppets to come into power while maintaining a veto. So all of these would now become more confrontational. So we could imagine that, if Iran actually enters the war in Yemen, that very fast the Emirati and Saudi vessels and troops in that region, in that country, will be defeated. They're already at the verge of defeat without Iran entering that battle. So similarly in Syria, if a hardliner comes into power in Iran, we most likely will see full deployment of Iranian air defenses that are very equivalent to S-300 in Syria. That hasn't happened yet. So it will be a much more confrontational situation.
Sounds like it. You know what? Thank you for joining us, Laith.
Thank you for having me, guys.
The voice you were just listening to is Laith Marouf, award-winning multimedia producer and media policy and law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples. Also focused on building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. You can follow him on Twitter at Laith Marouf. That is Laith Marouf. You can also check out his website, cmacenter.org, and that is center spelled the British way, CENTRE, cmacenter.org. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we will be back in a minute with our last hour this week and headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for our last hour this week, the last hour of the most disruptive show, covering news and events across our divided states, as well as across the divided, fractured, and embattled surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on that scarred battle surface, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas, on the wall.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I just want to point out, you will often bring up this wall in your introduction, but if we're living on a divided globe, the surface of a divided globe filled with fault lines, as it seems to be, at a certain point, those walls crack, don't they? You know, unless they're very cleverly built to like not run over any of these developing fissures. But the walls will come down. That's what I'm saying.
They're very cleverly built. Very cleverly built. It's built with sustainability in mind. That's kind of where we're going.
All right, let's get into headlines here. Andre just said something that cracked me up. Okay, in COVID news, at least 3,293 new coronavirus deaths and 238,189 new cases were reported in the United States on December 17th. Over the past week, there has been an average of 213,165 cases per day. That's an increase of 18% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of earlier this morning, broadcast live on TV, Vice President Pence and his wife, Karen Pence, got vaccines. I saw them getting the shots with my own eyes, in fact, for what that's worth. And this comes as, you know, vaccine drives in increasingly more, in an increasing number of countries. And yet the EU as a whole still seems to be lagging. And I wonder how they feel about that, but we'll have to come back to that. In our next headline, a panel of outside advisors to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration on Thursday endorsed emergency use of Moderna Inc.'s coronavirus vaccine. This comes 1 week after the same panel backed a similar vaccine from Pfizer and BioNTech, leading to an FDA emergency use authorization a day later. The FDA is expected to grant Moderna an emergency use authorization as early as later on today. Brazil's Supreme Court has ruled that Brazilians are required to be vaccinated against COVID-19 under the penalty of being banned from certain public activities and spaces. 10 justices of the 11-member court backed the mandatory inoculation with only one vote against in a virtual session that was held yesterday. The ruling is a blow to President Jair Bolsonaro, who said he won't get a vaccine and that nobody should be forced to. In national political news here in the U.S., the Energy Department and National Nuclear Security Administration, which maintains the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile, report that they have evidence that hackers accessed their networks as part of an extensive espionage operation that has affected at least half a dozen federal agencies, officials directly familiar with the matter said. On Thursday, DOE and NNSA officials began coordinating notifications about the breach to their congressional oversight bodies after being briefed by Rocky Campione, the chief information officer at the Department of Energy. And this seems to be, the solar winds, it seems like it's all part of a sort of wider breach that's been going on. And And like you were saying, actually, I hadn't seen this article, but you posted it. I looked into it. This is the allegation that back in 2019, a hacker was actually able to get into a SolarWinds server simply by guessing their password. And if I'm remembering correctly, the password was something like SolarWinds 123.
That's exactly
that's
what
that
it was.
one dude's claim.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's that one dude's claim. Who knows if that's actually the case? If so, that's immensely embarrassing.
But that's not the first time. I mean, NASA
pencil.
was like that. I mean, the dude from the UK hacked into NASA, and people. I think his last name McKinnon. Obama was trying to get him imported into the country. He was trying to get him exported from the UK. And David Cameron had to step in and basically say no. But he basically said that he heard NASA was hiding pictures or was scrubbing pictures from the public. So he thought, oh, okay, I'll go in and check. And he was like, it was just like password 123 or something like that. It wasn't like this kind of high-end hacking operation that they tried to make it. It was literally somebody just having the password not set.
I just want to point out, you probably do too. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, a little bit ashamed to say, I actually have better InfoSec than this like $5.5 billion company. That's the market cap, as far as I can tell, of SolarWinds is like $5.527 billion. And I don't think I have a password that's anywhere, or a set of passwords that are anywhere near as easily guessable as SolarWinds 123. That's just embarrassing, man. That's not the claim. Isn't that that's the source of the hack this time, the source of the breach? I mean, but just it's not good. And of course, if that's their password, if that's their approach to security, the question is, does that kind of negligence apply to their software, to their code base? Which would open them up to these breaches. Anyway, I think the answer there is yes. That's not a good look. Was that Jamarl?
I was just saying it's a design flaw that rivals the Death Star. Like that is like you have this massive planetary device that can kill, destroy planets that took 20 different planet economies to make. And it has the flaw that one bullet or one thing can destroy the whole thing. That's what this puts me in mind of, right?
Yes.
It's like you have this huge apparatus and this one flaw. So yeah.
It's true. No, that's always been an embarrassing part of the whole Star Wars franchise for me. Is like, wouldn't they? I mean, it's an empire. They've got a lot of power at their reach. Wouldn't they have protected themselves a little bit more than that? But of course, that strikes a lot of people when they're watching it. And hey, it's a movie, it's a fictional series. Anyway, back to nonfiction. In the headlines, President-elect Joe Biden chose Rep. Deb Haaland of New Mexico's 1st Congressional District on Thursday to serve as the first Native American cabinet secretary and to head the Interior Department. That's a pick that marks a turning point for the United States relationship with the nation's indigenous peoples. Haaland is the chair of the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. And again, that gives her more experience for her chosen cabinet position than Pete Buttigieg has for his. I'm actually going to be honest here. As far as I can tell, I kind of like this pick. This is the first cabinet choice that I've seen that I'm like, okay, I kind of can go with that one. Everything else, so far as I can tell, is various shades of shamefulness. In our next headline, Rep. Justin Amash yesterday introduced a bill to end civil asset forfeiture, which allows the government to take property from someone without ever charging them with a crime, known as the Civil Asset Forfeiture Elimination Act. Amash states that it would, quote, repeal civil asset forfeiture nationwide, end quote, sharing the text of the bill in a series of tweets sent Thursday afternoon. And that's exciting, not getting widely reported. I saw Reason, the libertarian magazine rag thing. I saw them reporting it. Other than that, haven't really seen too many outlets reporting it, but hey, it's exciting. I want to point out Justin Amash, libertarian representative there.
Very big deal.
International news.
Very big deal.
What'd you say?
I was just saying a very big deal.
It is.
That's good. That's very good. Somebody living by their
It
values.
is. It is.
Excellent.
Yeah, man. In a single week, you have that, and then you have the House resolution, the bill coming from Thomas Massey and Tulsi Gabbard to roll back to repeal the Patriot Act and the 2008 FISA Authorization Act amendment, which of course that was the whole basis for the Snowden thing. The rubber stamp courts.
The 99.7%
Snowden described.
The 99.7% of those are rubber stamped. Did you know that? Like the percentage of the FISA court. Yeah, it's just a rubber stamp. Do you think that this is indicative of change? Like that there is a shift that's taking place, where you kind of have this kind of iceberg sliding of sorts. I mean, like you said, the Amash, and in this case, you have Gabbard pushing it. And Gabbard has pushed bills before that didn't necessarily go anywhere. I'm just wondering if there's a dovetail that seems to be taking place from the standpoint of real libertarians, like the Rand Pauls of the world, or real conservatives that don't want the war stuff, and the left that don't want the war stuff, where they can dovetail. I mean, because the Democratic Party and Republican Party wants the war stuff. They are unanimous about it. But the left and the right are bizarre on this, talking about the populist components. They seem to be against it. So,
yeah, it's horseshoe theory, man.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if that is indicative of change in regards to the way we look at war.
I can hope so, but usually I try not to get my hopes up, because usually they're dashed. I mean, another thing that I would throw into the pot just to add to the case is, we were talking about this earlier, I sent you the link, is Giuliani on Fox Primetime, on Fox News, giving his support for Assange, basically, saying that he thinks that, I don't think he directly said that Assange should be pardoned, but I need to go back and watch it. Nevertheless, defending Julian Assange, defending WikiLeaks and what they did, saying that, they're a news outlet releasing leaks that were given to them, not doing anything necessarily illegal in themselves. Anyway, I just thought that was shocking. And so, yeah, there is this wave going on right now, but it's like a week-long process, and we're about to head into a Biden administration. And I do not think a Biden administration is going to be friendly on any of these fronts, with the exception possibly of the civil asset forfeiture one. But even then, they're probably going to talk a game about it and do nothing if it actually comes up at all.
The report real quick. Joe Biden did say he was going to talk to Maduro in Venezuela. Did you see this? It came out, I think it was yesterday, where Biden basically mentioned that he's going to talk to Maduro. That was the headline. I didn't get the opportunity to see it all, but I thought it was interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah, I mean, and this actually fits with guests we've had on to talk about this, where they think that the Biden administration is going to take a different tact when it comes to socialist nations in South and Central America, in the Caribbean and such. We'll see what that exactly looks like if he comes to talks, if we can lift the sanctions, if some people there can take a breath, economically speaking, and you're not going to get back to normal, but you might get some oxygen and ideally start to rebuild the economy. That would be awesome, but we'll see if that actually comes to pass. Like so many things, like I just said, man, I'm holding my hopes back. More than 300 schoolboys kidnapped in northern Nigeria were handed over to government security forces, the governor of Katsina State said in a televised interview. The boys, whose abduction was claimed by Islamist militant group Boko Haram in an unverified audio recording, have now arrived back in Katsina. We don't know what exactly caused the release of the kids. The leader of Boko Haram in that audio recording had said that the taking of the kids after this raid on this school by Boko Haram militants on motorcycles was caused by a sort of rejection of Western schooling practices. But good to hear that the kids are back, at least. Again, waiting more news on why exactly this whole thing happened as it did. The number of civilians forced from their homes by conflict in northern Mozambique has quadrupled this year to 420,000 people, according to the United Nations, which links the crisis in Cabo Delgado province not just to attacks by Islamist militants, but to a perceived failure to distribute vast mineral and offshore gas revenues to the local population. France will return 27 colonial-era artifacts held in museums to Benin and Senegal within 1 year. This follows a unanimous vote by the National Assembly yesterday. It's a months-long process from what I've seen. Overriding late opposition from the Senate, the National Assembly gave its final approval to a restitution bill transferring ownership of 26 plundered royal artifacts to the Republic of Benin and a sword from the Army Museum to Senegal. Pierre Buyoya, the former president of Burundi, who twice seized power in military coups and oversaw a prolonged ethnic civil war that killed 300,000 of his countrymen, has died at the age of 71, the government announced on Friday. He died in Mali from the coronavirus. And there are just a few hours left now for the UK and EU to agree to a post-Brexit trade deal. That's according to Michel Barnier, the French politician serving as the European Commission's head of task force for relations with the United Kingdom. Speaking in the European Parliament on Friday, the EU's chief negotiator said it was the moment of truth for the two sides to come to an agreement. He said there was still a chance of a deal, but the path is very narrow. The comments follow a warning from Boris Johnson that a no-deal scenario was very likely unless the EU position changed substantially. In tech news, Colorado's Attorney General filed a lawsuit yesterday against Google, along with the attorneys general of 37 other states, alleging that the tech giant is engaging in anti-competitive conduct in violation of Section 2 of the Sherman Act. In a press release, Attorney General Phil Weiser said, quote, "The states allege that Google illegally maintains its monopoly power over general search engines and related general search advertising markets through a series of anti-competitive contracts and conduct," end quote. This comes literally one day after the Texas Attorney General led attorneys general from other 9 states to file a similar lawsuit against Google. It also comes after the Department of Justice also sued Google back in October, similarly alleging uncompetitive and unfair practices. China's Chang'e 5 moon probe has landed in Inner Mongolia, China's Xinhua news agency has reported, completing its return and bringing back the first lunar samples to Earth since the 1970s. The return capsule touched down at about 2 a.m. local time and makes China the 3rd country to have retrieved lunar samples after the United States and the Soviet Union, who 44 years ago launched the last successful mission to retrieve samples. This is, by the way, Thursday morning. Sadly missed this story yesterday, so coming back to it. It's happened just a few hours before we went live. Anyway, yesterday, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged the stock trading app Robinhood with misleading customers about revenue sources and failing to satisfy duty of best execution, quote unquote, tacking on a $65 million fine to the stock trading app. And our last headline here, a joint team of scientists have transmitted qubits of photons, basically single units of light, of what we see, across over 40 kilometers of fiber optic cable using, quote, state-of-the-art low-noise superconducting nanowire single photon detectors and off-the-shelf optics, end quote. Scientists at Fermilab, AT&T, Caltech, Harvard University, the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and University of Calgary say the process they've experimentally verified here could, quote, provide a realistic foundation for a high-fidelity quantum internet with practical devices, end quote. The Caltech and Fermilab teams plan to build a city-scale network called the Illinois Express Quantum Network in Chicago next, although this network, the citywide network, will still be experimental, a far cry from gigabit internet. So just sort of trying to build a route to a quantum internet, which I still don't fully understand, but we should get a guest on to try to explain it to us.
Qubits.
Lay people at some point.
Superposition, up and down. Oh, as you were saying, the first time you mentioned the story, I was wondering to myself, how are they keeping these states where they can keep the superposition of states and prevent decoherence? But fascinating story. This is big.
It is. It is big. And not just in terms of the literal scale, 40 kilometers, over 40 kilometers of fiber optic cable. But like you're saying, they're basically transmitting single photons, the states of single photons over very long distances, technically quantum teleportation. And they're building it in a sort of engineering way to try to build out an internet in the long run that's based on this stuff, at least in part. In any event, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are going into a break. We will be back on the other side of this break talking with Niko House. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukeman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio and video. Also, Make sure you are subscribed to either Fault Lines or to my own channel. Google does weird things at times. Also, if you want to call, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Joining us is political activist and broadcast journalist and founder of CEO of MCSC Network, Niko House. Niko, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, gentlemen, how you guys doing?
We're doing okay. So we got really big news, especially from the general area that we consider to be the left. Nina Turner is running for Congress of Ohio. Now, this is big news. Now, Nina Turner was working with Sanders, a lieutenant for him, going all the way back to like 2016. And I remember the day that they didn't let her speak. And she was so despondent. Like, she comes out the DNC convention. They grab Sanders and they have him in a crate like they do the Roman generals. And they just kind of rolled him through the DNC convention. They were throwing eggs and potatoes at him. And Sanders was just crying and weeping. And Nina was basically forbidden from giving a speech. And I thought, that woman is going to be in politics. Like, I mean, she was already in the state level, but I thought she has to go to federal level. And after the last run with Sanders, it became clear, like, she was one of the people pushing Sanders to be rougher and tougher, especially on Biden. And Sanders' response was to hit her, to hit Sirota, to hit Zephyr Teachout. Basically, everybody that was trying to push him to be more aggressive, he hit. I guess my point is, she was one of those people doing that, though. What do you think about Nina Turner running? And what do you think, for the moment, her influence or impact would be? Because we know for ourselves, one person can't necessarily make a difference, but they can definitely galvanize.
So I felt like you, when we saw how she was treated at the Democratic National Convention, we know that Democrats really only treat, especially women of color or people that they can't tokenize like that when they feel like there'll be a threat for them in the future. For no other reason, just because they stand on their principles and their convictions. The Democratic Party has always been allergic to that. As far as Nina's personal influence in Congress, what I think that it could actually show and expose is just the reality that there is no real progressive left in Congress anymore. At least they may be progressive nominally, right? They know how to virtue signal and use all the rhetoric. And at this point, in my opinion, I feel like it's double speak. But we don't see the legislation being put down. We don't see the fights that need to be fought being had. And just like when we're talking about this Medicare for all debate right now, Nina actually put out a tweet that made it very clear yesterday where she stood on this. She's like, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to take Medicare for all to the floor for a vote. And although she won't be there to vote for Nancy Pelosi, the thing that makes Nina unique to, I believe, everybody on the left is that really no one at this point has a question as to whether or not she would be willing to withhold her vote. And with a unique coalition like Nina has, and a unique mandate like Nina has, from people obviously in the Bernie camp to people in the Tulsi camp to the Yang camp loves her, the Marianne Williamson camp loves her, the older conservative Black community in Cleveland loves her, which could potentially make her seat a safe one, which makes her even more dangerous to the Democrats. At the end of the day, progressives in Congress really only have their mandate, and I don't know if there will be anyone who is better at navigating that particular territory than Nina Turner.
And how do you think she's going to do? I mean, from what you're saying, she has a pretty solid base there. A lot of this still remains to be seen. As far as I can tell, there isn't polling out on this yet. Still pretty early, of course. But just your estimate. What do you think is going to happen there, Niko?
So we have to remember she already ran for Ohio State Senate and won. So that already encompassed a lot of the districts she's running in. In addition to that, it's an open primary. So that's another positive for her because obviously she appeals to independents while simultaneously appealing to Democrats, at least the more progressive ones anyway. This is also an area that has been, this is Cleveland, Ohio, dominantly Black, and it's an area that has been largely affected by Biden's crime bill, which Nina Turner has been vehemently speaking out against. And Ohio is one of the few states that the moment that a felon is released from prison, they are allowed to vote in elections, federal elections. So these are all things that, and obviously we know she's been out on Medicare for all, election integrity, all that good stuff. And she's even been shoring up her knowledge on the military industrial complex. So overall, she has an advantage from a strategic advantage from just a identity politics standpoint. She's already done this before in that area and won. Marsha Fudge and her seem to be on decent terms, so you hopefully won't see any attacks coming from Marsha Fudge's side or her team. And it's just basically like Nina has, whether it's on purpose or by accident, has put herself in a pretty strategic position to take advantage of her just being, hard on policy but soft on people, and then taking that all the way to the Capitol.
One of the interesting things you mentioned, hold your vote. Now, I think one of the disadvantages or one of the horrible examples that lefties have taken over the last 40, 50 years, it's kind of Carter G. Woodson. Lead a man to the back door long enough, the man would look for the back door when it's not available to him. Well, you have lefties who get 74% support for Medicare for all. And lefties still can't push that through. And not push it through, the moment that Sanders flames out, basically all of the lefty groups and everything else bend the knee, as opposed to pushing for the very specific policy that at that point they know is popular and has 88% support. Now, if you have a policy that has 88% support within the context of your party and you can't get that over the finish line, that is a failure. AOC has been put in this position where people are basically saying you should hold your vote. She made mention to the committee seat being an issue. Well, she just lost. She got shafted for that committee seat by a massive margin. Have you seen that? Did you see that? And by the way, and what do you think about the hold your vote stuff for Nancy Pelosi?
I agree with you vehemently. You should not vote for Nancy Pelosi. It's a win-win-win situation, or at least a situation where we stand nothing to lose. I mean, people forget, it isn't like if these progressives don't vote for AOC, McCarthy wins. It's if these progressives don't vote for AOC, then it goes back to committee, and then another candidate has to rise out of that, because Pelosi or McCarthy would need 218 votes to win, but the Democrats obviously hold the majority. So what you're doing is you're telling Nancy Pelosi, if you don't want your seats taken by another Democrat that doesn't quote unquote outrank you, which that hierarchy is BS anyway. But if you don't want that to happen, if you don't want that embarrassment, if you don't want this national, it's a show of manure to keep it censored on the radio. You need to give us Medicare for all, and this shouldn't even really be a debate considering we're in the middle of a pandemic, and y'all keep telling us to wear masks, take a vaccine because it's supposed to save our lives. So how about do the thing that actually saves our lives that we can actually afford to do, considering you just gave upwards of about $8 trillion to corporations? What is there to debate about? And so I agree wholeheartedly. I think that this is a way to expose Democrats. I think it's turning into a way potentially to expose quote unquote leftist progressives. And it's really showing that a lot of people have been hiding behind Bernie. They've been hiding behind gaslighting with Trump, and they've been hiding behind attacks on Tulsi in order to ignore policy. And I've been saying for 2 years, once this election is over and Bernie gets cheated and does nothing about it, because we knew that was coming, once the Democrats make sure they win, because Lincoln Project and the Transitional Integrity Project made sure they were going to let us know that no matter what happens, Trump was out. Like, they made it clear. So once that happened, no one was going to be able to avoid the policy discussion anymore. And we are now seeing the results of that.
Do you think this could force, so it's interesting, Jamarl and I have been going back and forth on this over the course of the week. I've been kind of critical of the idea simply because if it's a loss, if you can't get Medicare for all passed and you try to, and it's a clear loss, then that's just dispiriting. But I mean, I'm kind of coming around in some ways. Do you think there's any chance that this can serve as like a rallying cry for either expanding the progressive caucus or for creating some additional progressive movement outside of Congress, online specifically? Do you see that happening? Because right now it seems to be dividing a lot of people. But if you divide people up, sometimes that creates new groups, that creates new mobilization for some smaller groups. Do you see that happening? What do you think is going to go on, Niko?
I do see it happening outside of Congress already, and it's been building, but it's been building slowly. And to be frank, it's largely because Bernie was there, and because people could always kind of not only use Bernie in good faith to build their movement up. Also, you had a lot of people who would use Bernie and hide behind Bernie in bad faith to build their brand up, because Bernie's brand is very, very profitable. I personally know people who have basically become millionaires off of just tagging along while not really offering anything substantive to the movement outside of their empty words. Now, I understand why people may be hesitant to think, we know it can't win. The question, of course, then at that point would be, why couldn't we win, considering that we supposedly have 94 people in the Progressive Caucus? So clearly someone is lying. Then on top of that, if you want to be the Democrat, if you want to be the Democrat or Republican, because Fox News did a poll, and so that even 70% of their viewers wanted Medicare for all. So if you want to be the Democrat or Republican to vote against Medicare for all, after y'all just fast-tracked the vaccine through saying that it was about saving lives, and you're saying and then Medicare for all can't be done because, it's too expensive, but the vaccine wasn't too expensive, the CARES Act wasn't too expensive, then if you want that on your record in the middle of a pandemic, be our guest. I guarantee it won't be pretty for you going forward. And that's basically what the position that Jimmy has put a lot of people in by making this referendum. And I honestly believe that's why a lot of people feel a little bit overexposed. Like, they're in the lose-lose-lose situation because they either got to appease the people, their lobbyists, or they feel like they're voters.
Right.
And obviously the voters and the people agree, but the lobbyists don't. So now they've been put in a bit of a conundrum.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I mean, it's a weird.
Oh, go ahead, Shane. I'm sorry.
We're in a. Yeah, no, pardon me. I'm just going to take us into a break here. We're in a weird political situation. Just yesterday, kind of changing subjects slightly, but coming back to this point, saw a Washington Post headline come out that Trump's aides successfully walked him back from pushing for a $2,000 stimulus check. So for Trump to be pushing for a $2,000, no, they did that, but his aides walked him back. That would dwarf anything that I've seen Democrats in Congress calling for. And it's weird that, I want to take that headline at face value. It's weird, that story at face value. It's weird that we're in that time. It's weird that the sort of parties have shifted, maybe not permanently and maybe not in the long run, but at least right now on this issue. It's a weird position to be in. In any event, we've got to go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And if you want to call into the show, to talk with us, to talk with Niko, to comment, and to join the conversation, you can. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, we're joined by Niko House from the Mi Casa Su Casa Network. We will be back with him on the other side of this break in just a minute.
Fault lines.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. With us is Niko House, political activist and broadcast journalist, founder and CEO of MCSC Network. Niko, you are 1,000% correct. That plan that Dora came up with was right. That plan, in fact, the conversation that we're having now about whether or not to use leverage, whether or not to use power, that is something that should have been used for Biden. And it should have been a conversation on whether or not you really want to invest your vote into somebody if that person is not going to give you anything back. Meaning, if you give your unconditional support to Biden and to the Democrats, what are they going to do with that unconditional support? They're going to say thank you, and they're going to attend to the Republicans that they were searching out for, or they're going to attend to people who's going to put money in their pocket. Meaning, you giving them your vote and beseeching them to help you with X or Y is a folly. And that hasn't been the case for the last 40, 50 years. And also, to make a quick point of it, being docile hasn't worked. I mean, you have the DSCC, the DCCC that basically put through policy that blacklists any organization where a lefty is trying to take out an incumbent. you have another situation where these guys were going throughout this country giving money to various people or various politicians that are going to run. Steny Hoyer going so far as to tell a person to get out the race. I mean, one situation after the next where the left is attacked, maligned, and basically not or don't use leverage in those situations. This is one of the first times that I've seen this conversation take place. And so this notion of being unreasonable, and it's not even unreasonable, it's just correct, fight for legitimacy. So I agree with you entirely on this. And I even agree with you that the point is not whether or not it passes. The point is that you use legitimacy. The point is that you expose people who's not for Medicare for all. The point is that you allow the ability to run against those people so you get your people in office. There's several aspects to this that are positive. Do you think they're going to do it? That's the other question. Do you think the squad or do you think these guys at any point is going to go through with this particular idea? Because they seem to be really hesitant.
And she actually used Dave Sorota's recent article that was supposedly arguing to do this. And she said, no, that this is why I won't do this. And I think we should also, let people know that there's a clear pattern here, Jamarl. You're right. We haven't seen this from the left, and this is something we should have seen from the left regarding pushing Joe Biden uncritically, giving him our vote not me, but their vote without asking for or demanding anything in return. And guess what? The same people who seem to be more upset or distraught at this proposal are also the ones who told us to give Biden our vote uncritically. It's just really coincidental. It seems like maybe this isn't really about Medicare for all for them. This is about brand. And you can almost see in the way that they lash out at Jimmy personally. Like it's almost like it has nothing to do with Medicare for all, has nothing to do with the pandemic, has nothing to do with stimulus checks, has nothing to do with healthcare. It's about, Jimmy, how dare you use your brand to hold my brand accountable when you know that I can't do that? Why would you put me in this position to be held accountable, potentially lose my seat, potentially hurt my brand, et cetera, et cetera? We're supposed to be on the same team, Jimmy. What happened? And that's in and of itself is problematic, which is why you see the pattern of everyone who is upset about Jimmy's proposal also told you to uncritically, without question and without critique, vote for Joe Biden. And don't you dare, oh God, if you're black, you better vote for Joe Biden. No, you're not black no more. That's what we were told. So this is just, in my opinion, just a natural result of once again, what we have always seen coming from people who have clearly been just uplifting the brands over the last 2 years. But no one really wanted to admit it because, at this point, we're all desperate. And we just want to see that somebody is truly an ally. But unfortunately, it looks like the left has been left hanging again.
All right, we're taking calls. Wood, feel free to call back in. Right now, we have Anthony calling in from Detroit. Anthony, you're on the line. What's on your mind, man?
Hey, what's up, y'all? Glad to be on. My question, I hate to beat a dead horse, especially since, we're all in kind of agreement about the main issue, but one kind of tangent and, relevant to what Niko was just saying, and David Sirota, Jimmy Dore made a video covering explicitly this thing, last night, I think. And what I had called in yesterday and asked about was David Sirota's framing of it as, oh, do you want this or do you want Kevin McCarthy? I have to again ask why we accept that framing and why, especially when it's in a situation where in order for that to occur, we would have to literally see Democrats flip sides more or less, literally flip sides and vote for him rather, when in the general election, when it came to Joe Biden, that was entirely the opposite attitude of what we had. We kind of shirked that whole lesser of two evils argument, and we were adamantly against it. So I'm kind of confused on the lack of consistency in making that argument, or at least, could you guys? I'm not attacking Jamarl in particular, not attacking or anything, but I'm framing the question kind of to Jamarl. And then one other question I had is how you guys feel about shifting the focus from national politics to more local? Why don't we see much more coverage of local, more democratic efforts? Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Anthony. don't get it, right? So I've done like 3 videos making this argument that Dora's right. I've done videos even on fault lines, and there's been no hedge in that. I've been one of those clear people that made the point that Biden shouldn't be voted for, and that this lesser evil argument hasn't necessarily done lefties all that well, meaning you've been docile, and while you've been docile, they've still been attacking you and been maligning you. So my issue had to do with the behavior, more than anything else. It's if you and I are having a conversation and I start screaming at you, are we still having a conversation after that? And can we have a conversation in that context? Well, the answer, of course, is no. And it just seems like a lot of people are giving him a pass on that part of it. It's like, yeah, dude, you're right in regards to playbook. You're right that this conversation should have taken place now. And like I said, it should have taken place during Biden. And the lesser evil thing, yeah, if Nancy Pelosi doesn't want to put Medicare for all up in the pandemic with 88% support, then Nancy Pelosi shouldn't get your support, period. But that's separate and distinct from whether or not and how you articulate yourself and whether or not you're going to be somewhat disingenuous when you're attacking people. AOC is not standing between you and Medicare for all and some of these other comments. So there's a difference in those things, and both could be held at once. They don't necessarily have to eat each other. What do you two think? Niko.
As far as tonality is concerned, I see your point. And but the thing is, I can kind of sympathize with Jimmy because that's how people feel. People are tired of, the civility politics and, let's just be really nice and hope that things work out for us. Maybe that's why we haven't gotten anything done, because everybody else, we've been nice, we've been cordial, we've been respectful, we've engaged in good faith, and yet we still get maligned, we still get attacked, we still get smeared anyway, and then we don't get anything we want, and then we're called weak on the left. Now on the other side of that fence, there is a certain point where you kind of have to be like, what's more important? Is it tact or getting it done? And I do agree that although those two aren't mutually exclusive, you can marry both of them, and maybe that is best. But I do believe that it maybe not directly, but 70% AOC at this moment, given the context, is the one standing in between us and Medicare for all, because she's the one with 9 million followers. She's the one who she was just on David Axelrod yesterday, not making this argument to millions of people that she could have made it to. She's the one who was on 2 covers of Vanity Fair. She's the one who signed the CAA talent agency. She is the one with the clout. She is the one with the mandate. And if you have a mandate that's damn near as big as Bernie Sanders, what is the point of you having that mandate as a progressive if you won't do the one simple, bare minimum thing in the middle of a pandemic, which is do exactly what you said you were going to do, fight for Medicare for all, because it couldn't wait, like she said. And I think that from that perspective, Jimmy is right, because no one has the mandate AOC has right now. She is the one standing between us and Medicare for all, at least 60 to 70%. Obviously, she can't, use her pen and just pass legislation herself. But we know Trump's going to sign it, because Trump he's already used the Medicare for all to threaten Republicans before if they didn't get their stuff together on health care. We know that Democrats, if put in a position to vote for it, probably would, and they don't want to upset their lobbyists. I don't think they would vote against it. I think that's the problem. Nancy knows they won't vote against it. And they might get enough Republicans to support it as well. And so from that perspective, Niko, all AOC has to do is show some balls.
Niko, I've got a question for you here. We got 2 minutes left in this segment. We got 4 callers on the line, and I think a lot of them want to just talk with you. Is there any chance, I don't want to impose on you, is there any chance you can stick around with us on the other side of this break for about another 15 minutes?
Yeah, I got you guys.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, let's go to one more caller while we have time. Anthony, thank you for calling in. We have Wood on from Virginia. Wood, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, I was calling to clarify a position actually by Jamal's request yesterday. My point was that the context that you were missing was that when that conversation started, Sirota started off yelling and cussing at Jimmy. So when you say that it's Jimmy's behavior, you're not even speaking to what Sirota did. But the videos that you watched didn't have that context. That's what I was saying when I said you were missing context. because Sirota started off yelling and cussing. So for you to say that it was just Jimmy, that's just flat fact, not true. Now, I agree that a lot of times Jimmy goes overboard. He does a little much. I 100% agree with that. In that particular case, you had no context to what you were talking about. Sirota started that conversation like that. Not only that.
Well, real quick, why did
on,
Sirota come on cursing at Jimmy? He just randomly came on for no reason, cursing at Jimmy?
No, well, he came on there to clarify. But again, if he comes on there to clarify a position, that means that Jimmy recognized his mistake and is now allowing him to, like, if someone just lies on me and then doesn't let me clarify and come on and correct the record, then I would be upset. But if you let me come back on your show to clarify, why am I upset?
No. That's not what I'm getting at. That's not what I'm getting at. No. I'm getting at, why did Sirota randomly, just when he came on the show, you said he was cursing at Jimmy when he first came on the show. I'm asking, why? You don't think it's weird that a person would just come on Jimmy's show and just start cursing? Why did he come on his show and just start cursing?
I just said that.
No, you didn't. You said when he first came on the show, you said I had no context because there were two sides. There was the first time he came on, and then he came back on to clarify. I'm saying when he came on the very first time, you say he was cursing at Jimmy, and I didn't have any context because I didn't see it. I'm asking you, why was he cursing at Jimmy the first time around?
To be clear, it was not the first time. It was the second time when he came on to clarify. I guess what I meant was when he came on to clarify from the beginning of the conversation, he was yelling and cursing.
Yes, because he was misrepresented. That's why. That's the point I'm trying to make to you. You guys are acting as if when people say things, meaning I'm supposed to not care, or I'm supposed to care about Jimmy's feelings, but Jimmy is not supposed to care about anybody else's feelings. And the moment that somebody mentioned that, they're wrong for it. I mean, come on. Both of these things don't eat each other. And I don't believe for a moment that they do. Let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and House. We continue to be joined by the generous, the supreme Niko House. He is the founder and CEO of the MCSC network. By the way, you can and you should follow Niko on Twitter at NikoCSFB, NIKOCSFB. You can also follow the Mikasa Sukasa network on Twitter at MCSC network and watch their videos on YouTube by searching for MCSC network with Niko House. And we are also taking calls. We have a bunch of callers on the line, but you probably can get in if you try. 202-521-1320 is the number, 202-521-1320. We have Sean calling in from Maryland. Sean, you were on the line. What is on your mind?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. I think when we talk about the strategy as far as like getting past the Trump situation is fine. But my real question is, we're at this point right now. What would be a date or a time frame in which we start pushing? Should you push now, or should you wait 90 days in the administration?
Day one. In fact, the election itself, before the election, the pushing should have taken place in time. I mean, keep in mind, politics is leverage. It's not magic. And this idea that lefties have and African Americans have that cowardice is going to compel some kind of leverage within the context of politics is nonsense. It doesn't work that way. Think of all of the people that are trying to get Democrats to do whatever they do. Biden got, like $1 billion. Obama got like $1 billion. What do you think they do for that money? And all of the people who are tugging on him and trying to get him to do things. If you are engaging in politics unconditionally and you're doing so out of fear, why would they ever kowtow to anything you want when they have so many other obligations for people that is not engaging with them in that way? They're engaging with them in the sense of, I'm giving you something in order to get something back. No, this should have been done before the election. You should have held them accountable. Niko, what do you think?
Oh, yeah, that's what I was going to say. I was like, well, at least for as far as us three are concerned, from my memory, we've been holding them accountable and making demands for the last 6 months. That was the time to start. And that's for anybody and everybody's election. Even as I was covering Nina Turner's official announcement, I said, listen, I understand that we all love Nina, the person. She's been amazing. She's been ideologically consistent. But on the other side of that fence, she's now went back into politician mode. And therefore, if Nina is going to get things right and know what we want and what we need, we have to be objective and demand things now and let her know what we want and the policies we would like to see passed now, not after she gets to D.C. And that's across the board, including with Joe Biden, and especially, right, given his history, Joe Biden. And so, yeah, I agree with you, Jamarl.
100%. Yeah, you never stop applying pressure. And I mean, I'm saying this as somebody, I don't identify myself as a progressive, just a centrist dude or whatever. Not even a centrist, independent from the whole thing. But yeah, that is the name of the game. That's what you have to keep doing. In any event, we have more callers on the line. We're still taking calls, 202-521-1320. We got Stedman calling in from Detroit. You were on the line. Stedman, what's on your mind?
Hey, so I got 2 points to make. The first one is kind of, I'm going to kind of piggyback off Wood when he was talking to Jamal. So Jamal was saying, David Sirota was using that language because Jimmy was misrepresenting what he said. What Wood was saying was, even if, because Jimmy said this to David Sirota on the call, he said, hey man, you don't have to get upset about me misrepresenting you. If you claim I misrepresented you, I brought you back so you can say what you got to say. So that's the first point. He brought him back already so if he was misrepresented, then they went back and showed the previous tape. And the tape did verify what Jimmy said about what David Sirota said in the beginning about not being willing to risk Nancy Pelosi's seat, which is a misrepresentation. Anthony's made that. He said that yesterday, a lot of other people. So what you understand, or what I understand of it is, this is a lie. David Sirota is telling a lie. He's obfuscating the actual point of this whole debate about Medicare for all, sacrificing Nancy Pelosi's seat. And so Jimmy has the right to be upset. If a guy is telling you either a direct lie or he's telling you he's not willing to fight, and he was supposed to be on the campaign of the most progressive politician we've had in the last, since Eugene Debs or what's the guy from Wisconsin? I forget, the socialist from Wisconsin in the 20s, then we've got to have some accountability from the people in his staff. So you got the right to be upset. Also, David Sirota prides himself on using harsh language, curses in his tweets. He is this tough guy. He doesn't take any stuff from people. And so now, I haven't heard him complain about it, but now I'm going to defend David Sirota getting taken to task because he's been misrepresenting or directly lying or shown that he's not willing to fight for progressive causes. I don't care. You're a big boy. If you think Jimmy Dore is being too tough on you, speak up for yourself. If you got to meet Jimmy Dore in public to air your grievances like a man, speak up for yourself. When I have an issue with people, I got to go and do it myself. If I got to yell a little bit, I got to do it myself. Second point, CNBC has an article out talking about the COVID vaccine. You're not going to be able to sue Moderna or Pfizer if you have any issues with it. You won't be able to sue your employer if your employer has any, if your employer mandates that you take the vaccine and you have any long-term effects. There's something else about the federal vaccine protection or restitution law. Only 6% of American people who apply to use it actually qualify. So looks like, if it's a vaccine that works and we've had any kind of adequate protection, you shouldn't have that kind of safeguard where you can't sue. At least two healthcare workers in Alaska have had severe allergic reactions to the vaccine. They won't be taking the second dose. So, I hope Shane reconsiders taking this. You might just have to do some more.
I saw that. I know. I saw that. I don't mean to cut you off, Stedman, but I totally saw that. Also, somebody passing out on stage, a nurse passing out on stage after she took it. I'll comment that, but I didn't want to cut you off.
Not enough testing done. And that's really the basis of it all. We need more testing. If you want us to take a vaccine, we need to know that it's safe. Okay, America has a history of, look at the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. They have a history of doing evil things to their citizens. And so I'm not going to just take a vaccine because Joe Biden or Mike Pence or Bill Clinton or Obama or George Bush, historic liars, war criminals, say that they're taking it. Let me give them the injection, and then we'll talk about it.
Thanks, man. Stedman. So, few points. David Sirota did defend himself. He did go back on the show. He did push back. And the very fact that he pushed back, you guys are now complaining about the fact that he pushed back. The other part is you guys greatly care about Jimmy Dore's feelings, greatly care about people attacking him, and yet don't care about the other way around. I just think that's so bizarre. I don't think you can have it both ways. If we are having a conversation, and I get you think that somebody should be upset, but the thing is, the individual and what happens to the individual doesn't necessarily allow that person to behave in any particular way he wants. And undermining and pretending and being disingenuous about the attacks that were placed. Because it wasn't just, I disagree with Sirota, or Sirota said this. It was more so, he's a patsy, he's a hack, he's trying to get a job from it's all of this stuff that is so unhinged from reality. And so it's like, he goes back on the show, he's pissed off. Yes, that's the context. Now, this undermining and pretending that he has no reason to be upset is ludicrous. That's obscene. If you and I are having a conversation, I spit on you, it's like, well, I felt that way. I'm justified because I felt that way. That's nonsense. That's utter nonsense. There is no situation where any of you would be perfectly okay with somebody acting and behaving any particular way that they want it. You just wouldn't. I don't buy it at all. Brave. Thank you, Shane. Brave from ATL. What's going on, Brave?
What's going on, guys? Let me just say, you guys are producers. You guys should get them a raise because this segment is on fire. It's on fire, man. I just want to say, Mo, I actually agree with you. You are absolutely right, and in your intentions and your point, right? You're absolutely right. So I'll say that, but I will go a little bit further and say, I just personally, as it applies to the argument between Jimmy Dore and Sirota and the civil communication and all that, I just don't care. Like I think you're absolutely right. I agree with you. I just don't care concerning which one of them yelled at who. Not saying I don't care about what you're saying. I'm saying I don't care about the development, right? Because people should be pissed off. I want them to be pissed off. I want that energy to stay. So let it roll. And I will also say, everybody that's calling in and saying all these messages to Jamarl and arguing about the about Sirota and Jimmy and the fussing in space. How about y'all take that energy, right, and utilize that energy to call some of those numbers that Jimmy put out for the squad to keep putting pressure on them? Because right now we're just arguing about who should fuss and when they should fuss, and that really doesn't matter. So use that energy in the right place. And
yes, Brave, 100%.
Great step, but I don't want to hold you guys up. So have a good show, guys.
Thanks, man.
Thank you too, Brave. Thank you for calling. Yeah, I've kind of been sticking out of this one, but I'll be honest, it's getting a little bit. I get where people's energy is coming from, but like Jamarl is pro Jimmy Dore on this one, as far as I can tell. He's like saying that the dude's ideas are good.
I've done 4 or 5 videos. I was pro Dore like weeks ago when this first came out, and so it's like people are like, "Hey, man, you don't agree with 1,000% of everything." It's like, actually, I do. I just don't like his behavior. I've had run-ins with Dore and similar stuff like this, so I know that he drops context. I know that he doesn't have the nuance at times, sometimes when you're arguing. But you don't need all that at times. Sometimes that raw energy is a direct connection to the population, and it works. So I'm not against it. I'm not against this fire. I'm not against the relentlessness. Get up for all that. I'm just saying, come on. These are people who are basically on your side, and I just don't think you have to behave that way for allies. That's all. I mean, but teach his own, I suppose.
I hear you. You know what? I'm gonna have to take us out at this point. We have one more caller on the line. I want to personally apologize to Michael from Philly. Please call in next week. Sorry we didn't get to you, but as you can hear, this was a packed segment. Thank you also, Niko House. Massive shout out to Niko House. Thank you, Niko, sir, for sticking with us for this last segment. I know a lot of that was dominated by the Sirota door conversation with Jamarl, but I really appreciate you sticking with us in any event. Also, thank you to our other guests this show, to Alexander Mercouris, Laith Marouf. Thank you to everybody for joining us this week. Thank you to producers Cameron and Raheem. I think you're right, Brave. I think they do deserve a raise. Thank you to engineer Andre. He deserves a raise too. And thank you to Jamarl Thomas, my co-host, for co-hosting the show with me. Thank you to you listeners for listening and for joining the conversation. We will be back on Monday, folks. Have a great weekend. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Look, I hope my perspective on this is understood. Because I got to be honest, the conversations that take place, it's like, it blows past it entirely. Is it possible? To any degree, that's possible. For us to agree basically on what the world should look like. And on the areas to which we disagree, that it doesn't have to get, we're allies, man. I guess the thing that bothers me is that basically all of us are on the same side. We want the same thing. Any deviation seemed to end up in fuckery. That's all. And I exist on Fault Lines as a show. And there are right-wingers that come on this show. There are lefties that come on this show. You hear me fight with lefties pretty much every bit as much as I fight with right-wingers. I try to keep somewhat of an even keel when I regard to stuff. And there is be the integrity. I think that matters. I think how we talk to each other matters. If we're cursing, there is no conversation at that point. And maybe you don't care about the conversation. Maybe you don't care about having a dialogue. I do. And the fact of the matter is that dialogue is necessary for you to connect to the audience. Both things are necessary. The Poindexters of the world and the people with the emotional verve, both of those things connect to the masses, but they connect in different ways. I don't want to lose that thread. And I feel like this conversation that is taking place right now is vitally important, vitally important. It should have taken place before the election. Understand what I'm saying? When Joe Biden was running for office, and you had basically lefties that shut up. They shut up. 70% voted for him unconditionally. The conversation that we're having now should have taken place there. Meaning, yes, if you want to block Pelosi, block Pelosi. I don't give a shit who's on the other side of it. Just like I don't give a shit of who's on the other side of Donald Trump. It is the responsibility of the candidate to get your vote. And if they're not willing to get your vote, they don't deserve your vote. That's true for Nancy Pelosi. That is true for Joe Biden. And I damn sure believe that's true for a situation like Medicare for All, where you get 88% Democratic support. If the Democratic Party is not willing to support Medicare for All with 88% support, how in the hell is this a representative government by any measure? And if it is not a representative government, I don't need to play this game. I don't need to participate in this if it's not. And no, if Pelosi is not willing to put Medicare for All up, she shouldn't get your vote. If Biden is not willing to back Medicare for All, something he can do on day one, by the way, he's not. He shouldn't get your vote. And I mean that very truly across the board, even to the point of general strikes. We're in the midst of a pandemic. And in the context of this pandemic, you're talking like millions, 30 million people out of a job, 300 or some thousand dead, 3,000 dying a day. And what, 14, 15 million people infected? Do you realize there are more people at this point without insurance than are actually infected? But the infection number is going up. You have 30 million, if not more, people without insurance. On the day that Obamacare was signed and immediately after, you still had 26 million people without insurance. That has only gotten worse. And fact of the matter is the people who are most likely to not have insurance are the people who need it the most, meaning the people who are at the bottom of the income scale. Those are the people that have gotten slaughtered in this. Those are the people that never recovered from 2008. And so when I'm making this argument about healthcare or making this argument about elimination of college, I do that because it directly deals with the material concerns of the public. And if the Democratic Party is not willing to do that, then the Democratic Party should not get your vote. Full stop. The inversion of politics needs to stop. And, you know, whether that's this kind of vote for Pelosi after the DSCC have attacked lefties, after the DCCC have attacked lefties, all of these organizations went as far as the blacklist organizations that help lefties take out incumbents. AOC would not exist under that rule set. So this soft glance to Nancy Pelosi, this deference to Nancy Pelosi shouldn't be there. Even though I know the politics of it once you get in are different. No. Nancy Pelosi shouldn't be Speaker of the House. I also want to point out the pressure that's been applied to AOC on this has actually gotten her to speak up. If you notice, she started making these comments about Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer basically needs to lose their job, but there's no alternative, etc., etc., etc. Not giving your support is an alternative. It just is. Null is an alternative. All right, let me finish this up. I need to go. Look, I'm going to say like. I'm going to say share. I'm going to say subscribe. Look, I know that this is taking up a lot of conversation, meaning the AOC stuff. But it is important. It is important. For the first time in a very long time, the left has started to apply leverage. Dore was the instigator for that. And the conversation, meaning the people who are attacking Dore, the people who are going after him because of the plan and because of the pushing of AOC. Well, I agree with Niko. That's all. The TYT stuff. This is a conversation that honestly should have taken place before. And the fact that it's taken place with Nancy Pelosi, I'll take it. We honestly really do need to have somewhat of an appraisal of our politics where it's not unconditional. The unconditionality has not been beneficial. Families fight, kick, punch, it happens, that's true. Then you get new and it gets a beard, that's true. Please look into Dr. Chloe Anderson, push reparations as much as you do Medicare for all. Michael Williams, reparations, yes, I agree with. 1,000% agree with. In fact, we've had people on the show talking about that. In fact, we've even had Steve Romine on the show talking about the mechanics of it and how to pay for it and stuff like that. No, I agree with it. I know our producer agrees with it. I think Shane agrees. I'm not sure where Shane is on that. But, yeah, we can do that. We can start talking about that more. Or I could start talking about that more. I just need the opportunity to do so. Bob Ramirez said, flesh twice, it's a long way from America to TYT. That's hilarious. Are there any white progressives in Congress? Jay Scott. Of course there are. Oh, yeah. I mean, I would imagine there are. I mean, the race thing is not the determinant factor of whether or not the person is progressive. Nancy Pelosi is progressive. She's from California. That's what everybody keeps telling me. That's what everybody keeps saying. That's what everybody keeps saying. That's what everybody keeps saying. So, Michael, I'm going to see if we can try to get Dr. Claude Anderson on. I'll look him up and I'll see what we can do. Is that cool? Darn, J. Scott, people go after Sanders constantly. Yeah, they do. They attack him all the time. I mean, this channel goes after him. It's funny. My feelings of Sanders are weirdly mixed. There's this aspect of it where I'm like, the guy fights despite what happens. It's like digs in him so much, so ideologically. He deserves it. By the same token, aggravation, because of the inability to fight, the weakness that's associated with them. I mean, you have this righteous indignation and anger, but it's rhetoric. When it comes into real practice, the shrewdness, the ability to kind of push your case, being unrelenting, it's not there. It's just not there. And so the sheepdog stuff, I got to be honest, if I was one of those people in the Stop Sanders meeting, if it was me, and I would have said, let him in the race, because at the end of the race, he will give you his allegiance. You take that allegiance and you act as if something is going to come of it. You give them a prop. You give them something that they can basically chew on to assuage their concerns that they're basically voting you in office. Of course, you don't give any promises. You just say they're task forces. They don't mean anything. They don't have any force of law. They're basically there to obfuscate and to trick and to lie to your audience. That's basically what those task forces were there for. Now, that doesn't sit well with me, because if you remember, at the exact time when they were talking about him, I said they were bullshit. I said they were there entirely for the sake of giving this kind of leeway, this space to act as if Biden was going to be something or do something that he wasn't going to do. And at the moment that you get into the election with Trump, that stuff goes away. Like, the moment that you're in a flow of it, the public forgets that stuff and they start comparing people mano a mano. And the mano a mano thing is the thing that starts to carry more weight. The moment that you're in the primaries, think back for a moment. This stuff has all happened before. It's the standard pattern. When Obama was running, what did Obama say? There are multiple videos where he's going after Hillary Clinton for the public option. I mean, I'm sorry, not the public option, for the mandate, the individual mandate. And Obama basically says the insurance companies prefer Hillary Clinton's individual mandate because it forces the American public to get health care. I will not do that. I, Obama, am not going to have that individual mandate. Hillary Clinton, incredulous, is basically saying, you're full of it. Obama continues to attack her on that point. When Obama gets in office, what is the first thing that Obama does? Individual mandate. There was no public option. They got ditched almost immediately. And what did the public do? Accepted it, because they forgot about the fact that he said there was not going to be an individual mandate and ignored the fact that he was attacking Clinton on that point. The people who were backing him were never going to bring it up. The Clintonites didn't have enough force to do so, especially since they were pushing against the history of a black president going into office. But this happens pretty much every time. The only person who was straight with you was Sanders. And unfortunately, the fact that he was straight with you is in some part the thing that undermined him in the first place. Meaning, the thing that makes him good to be president is also the thing that makes him sucky to run for the job. Yeah. Like, share, and subscribe. Right here. Zaki Chaudhry. Shambles. Shambles. Unless their opposition to said strategy is their goal of sheep herders, then they are clearly sellouts and or enemies. Political pressure is a bitch, man. I'm not necessarily making an excuse for him, because I agree with you. At the end where Sanders flamed out, his mission wasn't over. And the problem is that when he left, there was a vacuum. There was demoralization. All of those things were taking place. When really, the honest truth is the hard work had just started. That just because you lose doesn't necessarily mean that your platform goes with you. What happens if Sanders turns around and says, of course you get my support, but the 30 million people that are out there, they may not back you unless you back Medicare for all. Now, clearly, that's leverage being used. That gives permission to the 30 million people to not make that vote, to have that conversation. And in the context of having that conversation, you at the very least bring about the potential for Biden to appropriate, the potential for a conversation of, hey, you got to appropriate this. You have 88% Democrats supporting a policy. Why wouldn't you bring that up for a fight? Be it in the media, be it in Congress, be it from the standpoint of the campaign. That is a fight that should have been had. And I'm saying that the politics of saying, yes, Joe Biden is going to get my support has nothing to do with using the mob. Each and every progressive group should have taken the mantle and should have taken this idea of each progressive group should have taken the idea and ran with it. Meaning when he comes out and says, Medicare for all, or maybe these 30 million people don't vote for you, Medicare for all, or maybe you lose this race, maybe you lose seats in the House of Representatives. Meaning you run a campaign, scorched earth, Medicare for all, or bust, because that's the thing that's important in a pandemic. I am saying being unrelenting in your push for it, every bit as much as King was for civil rights. That's how you get things passed. That's how you get things accomplished. He was not willing to do that, despite being right on the issue. And when Sanders flamed out, everybody else basically took the message, took the tone from Sanders, and did the exact same thing. A year, 2020, where you get to the point where healthcare gets 88% Medicare for all in the Democratic Party. It's nearly unanimous support. And the leadership in the party can't be bothered to back it. And yet you're in a representative government. I'll leave it on this. It is the job of the politician to get your vote. It is your job to make him come and get your vote. It is not your job to put any random person in office. This is not your job to put anybody in that office. It is your job to hold your political leaders accountable. That's not spitting and being disgusting or lying or being disingenuous. It is holding them to account. It is being vigorous. It is at times getting angry, especially when it's something where you realize the travesty of it all. Meaning all of these people are dying and these people are basically playing politics. That is aggravating, to put it mildly. They have all of these other countries around the world with healthcare. To see the number of Americans that are dying as a result, it's aggravating. So I get people should have some feelings about that stuff, and that should translate into political action. That should translate into this notion of fights and debates on whether or not, and strategy and plans. All of that stuff should be taking place and should have been taking place for the last 40 years. But in 2020, we royally fucked up. And it's hard for me to get across how much we fucked up. What was Medicare for all? What was the rating of it during Obama's period? Little to nothing, right? What is it now? Nearly 88% among Democrats. I'm saying that the difference between those things are the fights, the healthcare, the crisis from the standpoint of COVID. All of those things add into that, getting to that particular point. The iron was hot. You knew the public was for it. You knew you had 88% Democratic support. You knew you had 69% regular support from the standpoint of the population. Tip of the spear. And instead, we set the spear down and voted for Biden. At least 70% of Democrats, or 70% of the left. It's just unfortunate. That's all. It's extremely unfortunate. Biden said he'll restore the insurance mandate. Bob Ramirez, that's great. That is great. Bo Crumble, he'll throw out if he can get weird, but then he brings it back to the groove. Run for office, Jamal. I'm not running for office. You don't want me to run for office. You don't want me to run for office. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. Guys, look, all things being equal, I've always been honest with you. I'll always try to be straight with you. Whether you agree with me or not, I am trying to give you my honest take in the way I see it. Especially on the show, I try to be honest and earnest. I don't necessarily want to make a disingenuous argument, so I try not to do those. I think the more bang for the buck is when you can make an argument and it's honest, especially because at that point it pierces the actual the shield per se, especially if you're trying to convince and trying to get people to, come on your side or appropriate the ideas. Yeah, I guess my point is, look, I try to be honest. I try to be straightforward when we do the show. And for the most part, I've achieved that. There will be times where you guys are going to completely and radically disagree with me. There are going to be times I'm going to completely and radically disagree with you. Hopefully, that's not a cancel culture thing where it's like, I disagree with Jamal because he doesn't believe in this very specific thing, and so I'm just going to cut it off, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can do that, of course. But this show is called Fault Lines. And we spend every day yelling, fighting, arguing with people on all sorts and sides of the political spectrum. I can't afford to behave in an uncouth way, even when dealing with people that I don't disagree with. Not to mention, if you can act any way in any particular situation, so can they. And that doesn't necessarily lead to anything but chaos. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. Also, guys, make sure you hit the subscription button to make sure that you guys are subscribed. One last thing. I'm a fan of Dora. I've been a fan of Dora going back for like 4 or 5 years. Ever since he was on TYT. Eventually he started to grow on me and he became one of my favorite people on YouTube. If I'm not mistaken, I still think I even have him in one of my thing lists. So this is not coming from any kind of bad place or anything else. When I see, I want to be able to be full-throated. I don't like making videos going after people I like. And I definitely don't like when Cedar can laugh at somebody who I actually like. I don't think you guys realize it doesn't play well. It doesn't look good. It doesn't. Everything out of context looks weird. It just does. If you and your wife were trying to get sexy and everything else, and somebody was watching, it may be funny as all hell. But for the people in the moment, it's, so I get in the moment, all that stuff makes sense and it looks fine, but it just, I don't like people laughing at Dora. And all things being equal. Yeah, I'll leave it. All right, like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all. Oh, right here. Garden Gnome seems to be playing pretty well, Jamal. People have stirred up. That's a good thing. No, Garden, that's a good thing. Dude, you heard me like several days ago making the point that this is the conversation that's being had needs to be had. It needed to be had early. It needed to be had before, after the primaries. This is a good thing. This is a good thing. I just wish the edge wasn't there. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's one of those things where you can't get this effect of people being stirred up and having this conversation and talking about it and debating without the other edge. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the edge is just necessary component of it all. I don't think that's true. I think you can get across what you need to get across and have those conversations with people without it getting mean-spirited or without you trying to shout them down. I think we do it all the time. But you're right, Garden. It has stirred something. And I do think it's a positive thing, ultimately. So, good on Dora for coming up with a plan. Good on Dora for sticking with it, despite the fact that people were going after him. That's a good idea. Like, share, of course, subscribe.